don't need the screen sharing right now, Joe. You can stop it.
No, wait, just let him go live and then I'll stop.
All right. We have 155 registrations, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Shadi, you can start.
I'll start?
Yeah. We are live now.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Saisha Nagavarpu, a core team member of Doctors for Cause and the LGBTQ plus task force mentor as well. DFC is a non-profit and non-governmental organization. The work done by us will be shortly told by the LGBTQ plus task force head, Roshni Bagh. I welcome you all to Queer Conundrums, a webinar where we will talk about the LGBTQ plus community and see if there are any gaps in the curriculum that we go through as medical students on the same. Identify if a possible reason of the poor presentation of the community is that their interests haven't been represented adequately in our academic system. Firstly, I would like to thank all the participants who have registered for the webinar. We have received around 155 registrations and are extremely overwhelmed by this response. Secondly, all the members of the LGBTQ plus task force and as well as all the DFC board members who have been working so hard to make sure this webinar takes place smoothly. I would like to thank Dr. Ketki Ranade, who is the Chairperson Center for Health and Mental Health, School of Social Work, TISS Mumbai, Dr. Kostav Bakshi, who is an assistant professor, Department of English in Jadavpur University, on helping out Doctors for Cause for agreeing to be our panelists on such short notice and being so considerate and thoughtful. Lastly, I would like to thank Mahua Das, Roshni Bagh, for coming up with this idea to address the shortcomings in the medical curriculum, and Dr. Tirthankar Das, who has been nothing but supportive right since day one, giving us ideas, being there with us for every event, guiding us, inspiring us, being the mentor that we need, and appreciating the creativity in each and every student. Thank you so much, sir. All right, I hand it over to Roshni. Roshni, you can go ahead right now. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Shadi. Just a second. Hi guys, I'm Roshmi. I'm the project head of the LGBTQ task force of Doctors for a Cause, and welcome to Queer Conundrums. So I'm just going to tell you a little about the about Doctors for a Cause. As of this year, just one sec. Just 1 second. Yeah, as of this year, we have 8 task forces, each dedicated to its own work. We have the Animal Welfare Task Force, Mental Health Task Force, Academics and Education, Public Health, LGBTQ, Women's Health and Safety, Differently Abled Task Force, and Sexual and Reproductive Health Task Force. So I'd like to tell you a little about our journey as Doctors for a Cause. Recently, we crossed 13K followers on Facebook. So Doctors for a Cause started in 2017. The annual fest of KPC Medical College and Hospital, Plexus 2017, had just ended and we had a surplus of funds. So our co-founders, Dr. Sheikh Ayub Hassan, Dr. Arjun Talabatra, and Dr. Anujit Paul came up with this idea and formed Doctors for a Cause. Over the past few years, we've done several things. One of these is the Azadi Health Camp, which happens in association with Responsible Charity, and it happens a number of times throughout the year. We also did the menstrual hygiene campaign, and we have Team Soch, which is a street play team. We've headed by Sejal Chabra, and we've done a street play on HIV and AIDS. We also have the Rotaract Club health awareness campaigns and menstrual cup projects. Just one sec. Sorry, I'm a little technologically handicapped. Um, Last year, we also had Republic Day competitions and Children's Day competitions, and we had the ADSI project, which is in which we collaborated with the Alzheimer's and Related Disorders Society of India and the Ashari project, which is really close to our hearts. We also did ORS drives for the past 2 years in KPC Medical College. And during the Amphan Relief Drive, Doctors for a Cause we collected 50,000 rupees, which we then donated to Responsible Charity and to Nature Mates Nature Club, which works in Sundarbans. This year, we also celebrated Mental Health Month in the month of May and Pride Month in the month of June. And on the education front, we have the Academics and Education Task Force with Dr. Tirthankar Guha Thakurta, without whom we literally are like lost in DFC. Okay, so now that we're done with this, I'm going to hand it over to Mahua, who will be she will be moderating today's session, so she can introduce the speakers. Mahua, over to you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Hello and welcome everyone. I am Mahua Das and I will be the moderator for your today's session. I am a member of the LGBTQ plus task force of Doctors for a Cause and a third year medical student from Medical College, Kolkata. Today we are having a panel of 3 distinguished speakers for our webinar. Dr. Kostav Bakshi, Dr. Ketki Ranade, and Dr. Tirthankar Guho Thakurta. We are pleased to welcome our very first speaker for the webinar, Dr. Kostav Bakshi. Dr. Bakshi is an assistant professor of the Department of English in Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and a Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow. His area of work includes post-colonial literatures, queer lives, and cultures. He would be sharing with us his insights on why was homosexuality being either removed or treated as a pathological disease in mostly all disciplines of medical science. Now I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. Kostav Bakshi. Sir.
Hello, everybody. First and foremost, thank you, Mohua. And thank you, everyone else, for inviting me, Queer Task Force, Doctors for a Cause. I'm really excited to be here. So, many may be wondering that what I am doing here, like amongst doctors, given that, I teach English literature. The point is that we always believed, and this is the conversation which I had with Tirthankar quite a few days back, that whether there is an interface, the possibility of having an interface between, humanities and medical sciences. Because if a dialogue is opened up between these two disciplines, then perhaps today's topic, the fact that why homosexuality is so terribly vilified or even missing, or why
Yeah, I think there's a little connection problem from Sir's side. Yeah, it seems to be a network issue. We'll try to reconnect. Just wait for a minute, guys. We're trying to reconnect to him.
He's in the waiting room, I think.
Yeah, I've added him back. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. We can hear you now.
I'm so sorry. I think I lost the connection on my laptop. Anyway, so as I was saying that opening up a dialogue between humanities and medical sciences is where I would like to start today's lecture from. Could you share the PPT which I have shared? Is it with you? Can you share it?
Sir, I only have TGT sir's PPT. Is it the same one?
Yeah, it's called Queer Conundrums.
No, it's not the same one as mine. Dr. Bakshi has a different PPT.
It's a,
Oh, wait, just a second, sir.
yeah.
So did you mail it to us?
I mailed it to Tirthankar, I guess.
I can operate it, I think. So I might be able to share. Let me see.
Okay, sir.
Anyway, as you share the screen, let me just introduce what I was talking about. Basically, why homosexuality was not represented in any of the curriculum. Let's begin with the idea of colonialism, because of course we should start from there. It's important. It so happened that the Calcutta Medical College, which came into existence in 1835, for example, that was at the height of the colonial period. But even before that, since the 17th century and forever, there has been exchanges between medicine, ideas of medicine between the East and the West. There were many evidences of that. But the point is that by 1835, when there was a kind of Western medicine entering India, so to speak, one was in Pondicherry a little earlier and then later in Calcutta. So as it was entering the, this, so anyway, oh God, there is an issue, I believe. God, profile on Zoom. Anyway, so I'm losing connection, but anyway, I'll just. So the thing is that the colonial education system, which was introduced during the 19th century mostly, a little earlier, but in the 19th century, it was the height of colonialism and everything was being colonized in the sense that Western medicine, Western education, everything was coming together. But, okay, yes. Now I can see the PowerPoint, but anyway, I would get into the PowerPoint a little later. But before 1835, a lot had happened. What had happened before 1835? That the homosexual as a species, honestly speaking, if I use the term homosexual before 1869, I would be committing an anachronistic error, because the term homosexual was not, you know, was not invented before 1869. But why am I using the term homosexual when I'm starting from the Elizabethan period almost, is because just for convenience, for people to understand. Okay. Now, the point is that before medical science as a discipline arrived in India, anybody who pursued non-normative sexualities, particularly sodomites, were under the gaze of religion and law for the longest time. The point is that religion and law are two regulatory forces, and both regulate human lives based on what is right and what is wrong. And both religion and law have very strong, rigid notions of right and wrong. Science, on the other hand, is a knowledge producing system, and it gathers, it actually empirically, you know, takes us, it empirically, establishes knowledge about things uh, about which we didn't know. But the problem is, God, the problem is that for the longest time, religion and law had vilified sodomy in such a manner that science, on the other hand, could not be very neutral. What I'm trying to say is, whereas science should have started on a neutral ground, it didn't. Science started by assuming, that yes, homosexuality is a problem. That is to say, science was, without questioning, buying into what Judeo-Christian discourses and legal discourses had already done to the figure of the sodomite. When I say between the sinful, the criminal, and the pathological, or all of these, I am referring to any form of sexual deviancy, which for the longest time was being vilified in various ways. Now, Judeo-Christianity and law and science, all of these came together to vilify the figure of the sexual deviant like anything. And you should understand that religion, law, and science have very important roles to play. People believe in them. People have immense faith in religion, people have immense faith in law, and of course, people have immense faith in science, the rational. Now, if these three very important socio-cultural knowledge-producing systems vilify the homosexual as a sinner, a criminal, or a diseased individual, then of course it would have an impact on the popular consciousness, right? So even before the science of sexuality, which emerged in the 19th century, there was a very long history as to how that the figure of the homosexual subject had become an outlaw, a sinner, and a pathological figure. The point is that when I talk about colonial education bringing with it, as it were, that perception of the homosexual, let us also remember one thing, that in India and various parts of, in various other colonies, missionaries, Catholic as well as Protestant missionaries, both of them had a very, very important role to play, not only in the spread of education, but missionaries also played a very important role in healing. You know, healing and curing. They were mostly talking about the, the healing of the soul. But missionaries, because they didn't just work in cities, they were also working in rural areas. Missionaries were performing a very, very important role from was actually performing a very important role in uh, in what they called medical missions. Therefore, if medicine or medical knowledge or medical science was also being mediated through uh, missionary activities, then you can understand very well that the Judeo-Christian baggage associated with sexuality would certainly be there. You cannot neglect it, right? Now, in India, if I'm not mistaken, there is a very interesting work by Rosalind Fitzgerald. Rosalind Fitzgerald talks about how, missionary education and missionary intervention had a major role to play with Western medicine being adopted in the colonies. You can look up, although she doesn't speak about homosexuality per se, but what I'm trying to say that the missionaries also played an important role here. Now, this slide has some quotes from the Bible, Genesis, the book of Leviticus, the book of Deuteronomy. I'm not reading them out, just see it on your screen. But why, if you look at them, you will see these are the four which are oft cited, very often cited in any kind of discourse on, opposing any form of homosexuality. So I'm not going to tell you the stories now. There's no use, like Ham and Noah, Sodom and Gomorrah. You can look at these stories. But of course, these were reference points in the Bible for understanding, for, actually, proving to the world, or giving a kind of a, you can say, a kind of a religious stamp on the fact that homosexuality was not right. So within the space of the Bible, within the discursive Judeo-Christian discursive, endeavors, we had the homosexual as a sinner. Now, I would repeat once again that I'm using the term homosexual with the awareness that I am using it anachronistically. The term homosexual did not exist in ancient times. It did not exist till about the 1860s. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the criminal. Now, I am coming to Britain, particularly England, because we have been colonized by the British for the longest period of time, although we have histories of French colonization, Portuguese colonization, Dutch colonization, but the British colonization had the major impact on, on our lives, on our worldviews and everything. Now, secular laws in Elizabethan England. So in the Elizabethan period, there was a major transition from the church to the secular arena, where laws were being formed, more secular laws, which were not so much associated with the church, but certainly it carried with it, those Judeo-Christian ideas in them. And of course, the Buggery Act and the Elizabethan Sumtury statutes. These two are very important. So the Buggery Act was actually read down for a long time. So the Buggery Act was not read down for a long time. In fact, it was changed into, so it was like changed into the Offence Against the Person Act 1928, and Buggery remained a capital offence, as I say, till 1861. It was punishable by death, but then it became life sentence, a 10-year sentence after that. But this Buggery Act continued for the longest time, and the Elizabethan Sumptuary statutes see what they're saying, that it is inappropriate for men to cross-dress. It is inappropriate to women to cross-dress. Now you see that Elizabethan Sumptuary statutes, although they are posing as secular laws, it is actually carrying forward what the Deuteronomy had already said. Okay, that cross-dressing was a sin. This could not be allowed. Now let me pause here and give you an example of what was happening in Elizabethan England during this time. So why the Elizabethan sumptuary laws were so important? Because on the Elizabethan stage, boys used to very often perform women's characters all the time, because women were not allowed on stage and therefore boys performed female characters. And the Elizabethan stage was often viewed as a very, a risky space where homoeroticism was, kind of with the possibility of homoerotic desires being charged, uh, and people, lusting for those boys who performed the role of women. And also the sumptuary statutes were applied to a lot of women. This was a practice that many women used to dress up like men, used to, impersonate men in order to take to the streets. Most women, honestly speaking, they didn't have access to the streets. So they had to put on the garb of men in order to do that. In fact, if you see Shakespeare's play, As You Like It, which many of you must have studied in school, or may not have, but if you have seen, if you are aware of the play, in As You Like It, you will see that the female protagonists, Rosalind and Celia, they dress up as men when they leave their palace for the Forest of Arden. And this was not just a stage trope. It was something which was happening in England all the time. Women dressing as men. So the Elizabethan sumptuary statutes had to be passed in order to stop that practice. Why am I mentioning these two? Like the homosexual becoming a criminal. So anything, like any little deviancy, any form of deviancy from any kind of normative expression of sexuality was therefore legally not tolerated, legally unacceptable. So on the one hand, you have Judeo-Christian dictums, Judeo-Christian dicta, I'm sorry, and on the other hand, you have these secular laws. So the law and the Bible were in a way, in a very, very significant way, resisting any form of sexual expression which was not in alignment with the, with the sex assigned at birth. So that was something which was therefore, kind of creating this image of the sodomite, the image of the sexually nonconformist as someone who needed to be incarcerated, who would suffer in hell. He was a sinner. Now, this will continue for years, for centuries, and these ideas will be carried, of course, into colonial education, into the way people's mindset in the colonies will be changed, are going to be changed. Now, remember that the Elizabethan period was also the beginning of British colonialism. I've mentioned that on the slide. So British colonialism begins with this period. In fact, the prosperity of the Elizabethan period had a lot to do with the colonial enterprise. At that time, colonialism is more about plundering. Colonialism is more about exploitation. But colonialism became a vehicle of cultural imperialism a little later. This will happen in the 18th and the 19th century, more so from the 19th century onwards. But nonetheless, the colonial project has begun. So the empire had started to expand, which they called the New World. Okay? The point is that these laws were not directly imposed onto the colonies right away. It took time, gradually, as and when the empire was officially extended, as and when the monarch of Britain became the monarch of the colony. So there are certain historical moments when these transitions happened, but these laws, these ideas were gradually being carried forward. Just to repeat myself once more, that missionary activities, the church, and the colonial law, these had already from time immemorial almost, they were actually projecting the sexual nonconformist as somebody, as someone who could be vilified, who was someone we had to hate. That's a strong word. Tirthankar, the next slide, please. The pervert. So in the 17th and the 18th century Britain, there was this society which was founded called the Society for the Reformation of Manners. Now, Society of Reformation of Manners was mostly targeted the Molly districts or the Molly houses. Molly was was a euphemism for homosexual people, men who slept with men, men who were in relationship with men. So these Molly houses were targeted, and there are evidences of, I guess, more than 120 cases where they were pilloried in public and imprisoned and even murdered, executed. So these men, and because there was a constant demand that these Molly houses should be brought down and should be razed to the grounds, and anybody who practiced any form of debauchery, it was known as debauchery, like any kind of so that had to be punished. And the Society for the Reformation of Manners was doing their job really, I mean, quite well, in fact. Now, there was this man, John Disney, A View of Ancient Laws Against Immorality and Profaneness. Now, you see the title of the book, A View of Ancient Laws Against Immorality and Profaneness. Now, in this book, this is a very significant book, which we usually do not talk about, but this book had a major impact in envisioning the homosexual who would emerge as a species in the 19th century. It strongly recommended the necessity of an anti-sodomy law. Now, there was already a Buggery law. There was a Buggery law, but he said that no, you call it anti-sodomy. And the book placed homosexuality in the same category as, say, adultery, incest, rape, prostitution, bestiality, theft, everything. John Disney very interestingly also notices that there was a homophilic culture in classical Greece, and there was a lot of acceptance. But even then he says it's shameful that such great cultures could promote homosexuality. He actually says that. And this book, A View of Ancient Laws Against Immorality and Profaneness, look at the word immorality and profaneness. Now, immorality and profaneness are religious terms to begin with, and law is using the terms really immorality and profaneness to describe homosexuality. So you can see how law and religion are kind of collaborating to put the homosexual into the category of the criminal, somebody who had to be absolutely eliminated. Right? Now, this was also the turning point. This was also a turning point in understanding human mind, human body, because the 18th century was also the time of the Industrial Revolution and what we called philosophically the beginning of the Enlightenment era. And Enlightenment, which was constantly emphasizing on a rational understanding of the cosmos, the rational understanding of the human mind, the rational understanding of society and civilization at large. So this was also the time when science as a discipline was also coming into existence. This is not to say there was nothing called ancient science. Certainly there was. What I am talking about is that this is also the moment for the emergence of science as a discipline, the kind of science that would be taught in university or school curriculum. Okay, so we didn't have so much of public education before this. I'm talking about Britain, not so much public education in the sense of institutionalized education, like school, college, university. All of these are going to gradually emerge post-Enlightenment, where more common people will be drawn into the education system. So education was not so easily available to the commoners before this. It was more confined to the upper classes, the nobility, the monarch, the knights, maybe, but not so much for the common people. So this is the time when democracy also takes roots, and this is also the time when education is also being made available to a lot of people, and this is also the moment when science is birthing as a discipline. And at that moment, we have John Disney's work, which is it is projecting homosexuality as a profane act, as a sinful act, something which needs to be completely vilified and eliminated. Tirthankar, next slide. So the pathological figure. Acha, could you admit Raina Ghosh? I mean, I'm not being able to see the screen at all. And yeah, so the pathological figure. Now I am jumping straight to the 19th century. I could have spent more time in the 18th century because the 18th century is fascinating, but we do not have the time. I'm jumping straight to the 19th century when we see the emergence of the science of sexuality. Now, this is the science of sexuality which is majorly responsible for the vilified figure of the homosexual. Now, you see, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm repeating, and this is very important, that this strikes me as really sad that, you know, science did not feel the necessity to start on a neutral ground. Science began with the hypothesis that homosexuality was certainly a problem. Why? Because science was here colluding with law and religion. Science should not have colluded with law and religion. Science should have taken its own neutral avenue. It did not take that. Because for the longest period of time, the sodomite or the bugger, so to speak, these were more abusive terms at the time, because they had that kind of a projected image. So science also accepted it. This is strange. Science should have started by questioning that why at all homosexuality is being treated as unnatural. No, science started with the hypothesis that homosexuality is unnatural. That is to say, science of sexuality began by asking the wrong question. The problem is, when you do a hypothesis, you do not have the outcome. Here, science already had the outcome. What was the outcome? Homosexuality is a problem. What were they doing? They're trying to rationalize why homosexuality was a problem. This is the biggest issue with science of sexuality. That you shared a result without even empirically testing it, that whether your result is true or not. Now, if this is so, of course, you can understand that science, which is kind of revered, which is looked upon as that, you know, wonderful discipline in which everyone has faith, if you start with that kind of an idea, this would be a problem. Now, also, I would also draw your attention to the fact that there were, I would say, little rays of hope also along with this. But before that, let's look at Karl Maria Kertbeny, 1869. This is the year in which the term homosexual was actually coined. Before this, the term homosexual did not exist. The term homosexual has a scientific ring to it. This is exactly the moment when the term homosexual, the figure of the homosexual is emerging as a biomedical figure who needs the attention of science. So far, the sodomite, the bugger were actually the concern of law and religion. Now, law and religion exists even now, but the term homosexual and the term heterosexual, which was also coined almost in the same year as a binary opposite to homosexual, but homosexual as a term was emerging as a biomedical pathological figure to which science must pay attention, as if it is a disease which needs to be cured. So the problem with science of sexuality to begin with, that it started with the idea that homosexuality needed cure and they need to find a way out, that what could be the curative measure, without even asking that whether homosexuality at all needed to be cured. So all the wrong questions were being asked by Richard von Krafft-Ebing. Yeah, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, I'm sorry, is the man responsible for what homosexuality is today in many of your medical books, in many other discourses. And you see, Richard von Krafft-Ebing identified it as a congenital disease which had its roots in genetic abnormality. The cause, which could be discovered in many in family histories, if those were investigated. This is exactly what happens even today in various parts of the world. What he did at the end of the 19th century is something which is still being carried forward. Because he began with the assumption that it is a congenital disease, he never thought that the question which was being asked was a wrong question. Therefore, homosexuals now became case studies in sexual deviancy. Do you see the problem here? Do you see the problem of the scientific discourse? That it is establishing the homosexual as a case study. The moment you do that, and heterosexual in comparison as its binary opposite became the standard of normalcy. And homosexuality, the verified abnormal behavior in sexuality. This is what happened in the 19th century. And see, by this time, the Kolkata Medical College has come into existence. That is to say, Western medicine has gradually entered the colonies. I would like to tell you here that there is a book by, what is his name? Pratik Chakraborty, if I'm not mistaken. Pratik Chakraborty's book, Empire and Medicine, which has been published by the University of Manchester in 2014. It's a very interesting cultural studies of how the medical discourse actually became a very important part of the colonizing mission. And also, during this time when Western medicine was being gradually imported, all other forms of indigenous forms of healing, indigenous medicines, all of those were gradually marginalized because there was tremendous suspicion towards any form of subaltern practices. I'm calling them subaltern practices. That is also a very new term that was not so much in use in the 19th century. But of course, these practices, these indigenous native practices, medicinal practices were completely marginalized. And therefore, this is the time the pathological figure of the homosexual emerged. And of course, it also entered the scientific discourse as a disease which had to be cured. It was like the COVID-19, perhaps. The homosexual carried a certain germ which had to be purged. In fact, later on, you will see even in 1992, in 1940s, in the 1930s, people will continue to find a cure for homosexuality as if it could be cured. And the moment you say it's a pathological figure, of course, you can understand that if it is a pathological figure, it is already a diseased figure. Then it's a problem, like. So this is where science of sexuality made all the all the goof ups, all the messy things happened in the 19th century. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Race and sexuality. Why am I moving to race suddenly? I'm not moving to race suddenly, but this intersection needs to be understood here. Why were the Western Europeans and the Britishers, all of them, were so concerned to project homosexuality as a problem? Because it was the time when race studies was at its height. Why was race studies so important at that time? Race studies was important because the project of colonization had to justify to the world that we are plundering you, we are exploiting you, we are dominating you, we are politically controlling you simply because we are better than you. Why are we better than you? We are Christians, we have white skin, and maybe we have Caucasian features, we look much better than you. So perhaps those with brown skins, those with yellow skins, those with, not such chiseled features can be colonized by those who had it. So race studies was very important. It was central to the colonial discourse at the time because they had to establish the European race as a superior race as against any other race which was inferior. So while establishing the superiority of the white people, the race of the white people, they had to show everyone else as inferior. How inferior? Morally inferior, ethically inferior. And they could be inferior in their understanding of the world. They could be inferior in knowledge, everything. Now you see, I have written it on the slide that while race studies was on, so at the center of race studies, we had body sexuality and sometimes genitalia. Genitalia was measured, and mostly non-European races were projected as oversexed. people, they indulged in all kind of, sexual debauchery, decadent, they were a decadent culture. So these were spread across Britain, because please remember that within Europe also, there was a lot of opposition towards colonization. It was not just the empire which was opposing it. It's not just the colonized people who are opposing colonization. People from within the colonies, from within the colonizer's own country, people were also opposing it. So in order to establish the validity of colonization, they had to project anybody who was a non-European as an inferior person. And when they were projecting those people as oversexed and unethical, they also started spreading, they were also homosexuals. They're also homosexuals without realizing that in many of these indigenous ethnic groups, homosexuality was a very, very common practice which nobody ever questioned. The sad part is that this colonial perception of homosexuality became the dominant perception. Why did it become the dominant perception? Why not my perception and the perception from, say, India or Africa or any other place was not dominant? Because the knowledge was being produced by the colonizers. Knowledge was not produced by the colonies. Knowledge began to be produced by the colonies after they were educated. And we have this whole phenomenon of the empire writing back. But the empire writing back could only happen after the 18th century or the 19th century, and in a huge way in the 20th century. But knowledge production was simply happening from the center of the colonial masters' citadel. So as a result of that, everybody, believing that, oh my God, these people are homosexuals, these people are not so civilized, they are like into witchcrafts, they are into these kinds of ritualistic practices, these are so obnoxious, these are so abominable. So, all right, colonization is, of course, justified. Now, as the empire expanded, you see the second point here, and I've mentioned a few races where homosexuality was found to be practiced in the most normal way possible, with nobody even questioning it. But the irony of the situation is the knowledge about these races where homosexuality was a common practice, which people never questioned, it was only part and parcel of their lives, they were not the knowledge producers. The knowledge was being produced by the more educated, relatively quote unquote more civilized white colonizers who were actually coming here as anthropologists, and they were establishing knowledge in their own sweet way. So the colonies never had a voice. Now, do you see the intersections of otherness? What I mean by intersection of otherness, that the homosexual became a kind of a non-European figure who had to be hated, and it was associated with the dark skin, it was associated with the yellow skin, with the brown skin, anything which was non-white. So this intersection is very important for us to understand. Can we move to the next screen, please? Friends of Oscar, the unnameable outlaws, I would just, pause here. This is a pause screen for you to think from another perspective, that while people from the colonies, that is a new world, that is a non-European world, they were projected as homosexuals, what to do with the homosexuals who were really at home? There were a lot of Europeans, hundreds of Britishers who were homosexuals. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
I'm audible. Yeah. Sorry. There was a phone call which was coming in, and that's why. Anyway, so the false notion that homosexuality was un-European and belonged to the less civilized colonies, which functioned on natural rather than cultural laws, was widely dissipated. Fine. Very good. But what will you do with those at home? There were lots of Britishers, lots of Europeans who were homosexuals. Now, problem was, or the good thing was, these people were mostly not very articulate of about their sexualities. The Oscar Wilde case, the Oscar Wilde trials of 1895, has now become, you can say, iconic in understanding Britain's drive to completely eliminate the homosexual It is an iconic incident. Why? Because Oscar Wilde, unlike many of his companions, many of his cohorts, chose not to remain silent about his homosexuality. Homosexuality was tolerated in Britain as long as it was tolerated within the closet. It was, performed within the closet. If you made it too visible, if you made it too public, if you articulated it, then of course there was a problem. And what Oscar Wilde did, he just wanted to be honest. But then, of course, no. He was prosecuted, he was punished, he was shamed like anything. And what is Friends of Oscar, which the title of this slide? Now, Friends of Oscar emerged as a circumlocution, or you can say a label for homosexuals, because polite people could not use the term homosexual. They're so ashamed to, even mention the term in polite conversation, and therefore they chose Friends of Oscar. That was a fantastic euphemism. I believe it happens a lot in Kolkata nowadays. People call femme boys Rituparno Ghosh. It's like that, So Friends of Oscar. Now, the thing is that why was Oscar Wilde so terribly, shamed, prosecuted, and actually sent to prison? Why did it happen? Because Britain had to prove to the world that we are so intolerant of homosexuality that if you ever come out, this is exactly what we're going to do. This is also the time when the draconian colonial law of anti-sodomy was also exported to the colonies, and it came into India, which later became Section 377 of the IPC. Okay, what we understand as Section 377 of the IPC is that this anti-sodomy law, under which Oscar Wilde was prosecuted, was imported into the nation, into India, and it became Section 377. Now just look at this. Law, religion, science. Again, the collaboration never breaks. The collaboration continues. Race studies, anthropological, right? Anthropology is social science. Law continues to prosecute homosexuals, and the language everywhere, if you look at the language, is so religious. It appears to have been derived from the religious discourses which existed at that time. If you read Oscar Wilde's very interesting essay, Do Profundis, you will see what I'm talking about. So the collaboration between law, religion, science, it continues, and the colonies by this time were gradually getting kind of, implicated in it. Now you see, because colonialism in all aspects, in all forms, in all its, discursive manifestations, were gradually replacing and displacing everything which was native and indigenous, tolerant attitudes towards homosexuality also got gradually lost in the colonies. Because you see, there was no knowledge production. People never wanted to say that, well, it is quite common here, because that kind of knowledge was not being produced, not in volumes as it was produced in the US. We do have our, knowledge systems here, but not the way it was overwhelmingly produced in print and circulated in the colonial master's citadel, right? So I believe I can make the connections. Can we go to the next slide? Rays of hope. So was there a ray of hope? Yeah, there was. Like Havelock Ellis, Ernest Colley, Richard Burton, Edward Wassermark, Edward Carpenter. They were instrumental in formulating an idea of sexuality which went beyond the that understanding of the homosexuals as sinners, as pathological, as criminal. They were looking at it from a different point of view. Now, how were they doing it? Two books I've mentioned here. One is Sexual Inversion. The other I mentioned is Intermediate Sex. These were path-breaking books in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when they were positing a positive picture of homosexuality. But remember one thing, that this alternative view of homosexuality, which was more queer affirmative, the term we use today, this affirmative literature was much less in number in comparison to the homophobic literature which was being produced. All right. So even then, even when we had a Richard Burton, even when we had a Havelock Ellis, even when we had an Edward Carpenter, no, nothing could happen, not so much. It could not change people's views. I would give you an interesting information that Richard Burton was the one who translated our Kama Sutra. Why am I mentioning this? Because the Kama Sutra does have a chapter on homosexuality, and you will be surprised to know that the chapter on homosexuality was actually removed in the translation when it was circulated in the Western world. Now, the translation which is available today, now it contains that chapter, but Richard Burton's translation of homosexuality, which was popularly circulated, that didn't have the chapter. But anyway, these anthropologists, sexologists, psychiatrists, all of them were kind of collaborating. But there was a group which was collaborating to produce a more kind of a more affirmative picture, but the negative pictures were so much in abundance that it couldn't really do anything, to completely eliminate what was happening around homosexuality at that time. Next slide, please. So here I've moved to Germany, and this is important, that why have I moved to Germany? Because let's remember the Weimar Republic in Germany. I will not elaborate on the Weimar Republic in this talk. We can do it later sometimes. The Weimar Republic had this very fascinating committee, which is a scientific humanitarian committee, which was founded in 1897, and later on Institute for Sexual Science. Both were founded by Hirschfeld. Okay, and first one was by Kurt Hiller, and then of course the other one. But the point is that these two committees and the institute, the committee and the institute, they functioned hand in hand. They they worked hand in hand to produce a very, very positive picture of homosexuality, a very positive picture. And the Weimar Republic is sometimes considered to be a kind of a utopic republic where liberty of thought, where liberty of any kind of anything which was beyond the normative was actually accepted, because democracy was celebrated here like nowhere else. Hirschfeld's homophilia. Now you see that on the slide there is a prominent mention that both Hiller and Hirschfeld were Jewish. This mention is important because the Weimar Republic came to an end with the Holocaust. With the rise of the Nazis, with the rise of Hitler in the beginning of the Second World War, that towards the late 1930s, 1939 in particular, during that time, with the rise of the Nazis, the Weimar Republic collapsed. And as all of you know, that the Holocaust is one of those incidents which we can never forget, as one of those iconic events to have, actually literally, persecuted, chased, and killed homosexuals. So the liberal views, the very progressive views of the Weimar Republic were completely lost when the Nazis rose in power and the Holocaust happened. So even then, the Scientific Humanitarian Society Committee and Institute for Sexual Science, these could not really sustain. They have gone down in history, certainly, but they could not sustain themselves because the Nazi power was overwhelming. And just one information I would give you, Kurt Hiller, for example. Kurt Hiller, see, he was a doctorate in law, and Hirschfeld was sexologist. Now, very important collaboration. Who came together? Law, the lawyer, and the sexologist, the scientist and the lawyer. Do you see the collaboration continues now in a positive way? Now, Hiller was one of those who actually proposed the Pride March. He actually said people should take to the streets in order to claim their sexuality, but nobody paid him attention at that time, not even Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld said, no, we have to produce knowledge, we have to educate people. It was not so much about taking over the streets. But but Hiller had that, again, a very iconic and a very significant role to play to even propose a pride march. Of course, it was not called the pride march, but he said that, well, people should take to the streets and claim their sexuality, they should make themselves more visible. Visibility was very important. So you see, whereas science, law, and religion were collaborating together to construct a very negative image of homosexuality within the Weimar Republic, again, the scientist and the lawyer came together in opposition to that negative view of homosexuality and created something extremely affirmative and positive. But as I said, just to repeat myself, with the Holocaust, the Weimar Republic ideology completely came to an end. It could not be revived, right? Okay, next slide. Well, it is interestingly called the Freudian dilemma. Freudian dilemma, and I am quoting from 1935 from Freud's very famous letter to the mother of a homosexual son. And he says, homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to do ashamed of, no vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. Now, Freud could have stopped with this line. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function. Freud made a huge mistake by adding the next conditional clause produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. That's why I'm calling it Freudian dilemma. No matter how much positive, affirmative, progressive Freud sounds in this very, very iconic letter, the last line, it is not the last line, it's a very long letter. I've just quoted a part of it. Arrest of sexual development. The moment you say it was an arrest of sexual development, what are you doing? You are again projecting a disease. You are again, pushing it into the zone of the pathological. That arrest of sexual, why did he mean by that? What, arrest of sexual development. So this, to the popular understanding, would have various meanings. It would have various meanings. The problem is, this letter of Freud is very oft quoted, but if you read in between the lines, you will see what I'm referring to as a Freudian dilemma. Yeah, somebody says it's a Freudian slip. No, it was not a Freudian slip. It was not a Freudian slip. It was very, very conscious. It was very conscious. He wrote it because, you see, psychiatrists at the time was not very comfortable with homosexuality, because psychiatrists, even then, like Freud himself, they were again trying to look at the cause of homosexuality. Now, let me tell you, many of you are doctors here, and I am just see, the moment you look for a cause, the word cause is problematic. You are looking for a cause of something in a person. That means there must be some anatomical, some kind of an organ disorder somewhere, right? So if you're looking for a cause, you are creating a huge problem around that issue. Freud was also looking for a cause, but in the 1930s, during this time, he was in Germany. Freud also said that most people are bisexual. He actually made that very significant statement, and it is very often quoted by many people who try even now. But the point is that when he said most people are bisexual, that was a wonderful thing to say. But I would have expected Freud to say that most people could be pansexual as well. But the term pansexual was not available at that time. But what Lacan did, what Jacques Lacan did much later in post-structuralist psychoanalysis, was something which Freud couldn't do, because he was thinking on more structural lines, and Lacan thought in a more post-structural way. And then, of course, sexuality was looked upon as a continuum, as a cloud. It had nothing to do with like bisexuality, homosexuality, heterosexuality. So these very strong, rigid categories were kind of, very gradually eliminated. But of course, mainstream psychoanalysis, mainstream psychiatry, I believe they couldn't really give up on what was in circulation since the 19th century. And the Freudian dilemma is something which actually didn't do much, did not do much help to projecting the homosexual as somebody who should not be vilified. And another information here, Freud's daughter, Anne Freud, for example, is known across the US as someone who had been promoting conversion therapy. So you can understand Freud had no impact on his daughter as well. So if Freud could not convert his daughter, I'm not sure whether he could convert anybody else, but whatever it is. Next slide, next slide. Problem with language, even in positive attitudes to homosexuality. This is something which is very, very important for us to understand, that how language creates problems. Now, in the slide on Rays of Hope, and of course, next is the one on Weimar Republic. In both the slides, you will see that even when anthropologists, sexologists, lawyers, psychiatrists, even when they were talking about homosexuality in a positive way, the terms they used were terribly negative. Abnormal sexualities, inverted sexualities, deviant sexualities. So abnormal, inverted, deviant, even so see, if you use these terms, then automatically what are you doing to homosexuality? You are looking upon homosexuality as something inferior, something which is not natural, something which is not quote unquote normal. So if you can, even when you are affirmative about homosexuality, if you continue to use these terms, then what are you doing? You are actually, constructing heterosexuality as a norm by default. So heterosexuality is not abnormal. From the point of view of a homosexual person, heterosexuality could be abnormal. I may just look upon a heterosexual couple and say, oh my God, so such an abnormal behavior, a girl holding the hand of another boy. Oh my God, it's so horrible. I can't even imagine looking at it. Can't I say that? I can. But we don't say that because heterosexuality has been established as a norm. Right? So even in affirmative representations of homosexuality, we saw this, I would say, that this kind of a fault, a terrible fault. They never thought of an affirmative phrase. An affirmative phrase could have changed things a lot. Next slide. Establishing homophobia. By the way, we are still in the 1930s, okay? So we're still in the 1930s, and I would end with the 1930s only because what happens with homosexuality today, all of them had been kind of consolidated and established by the time. So establishing homophobia, Committee for the Study of Sex Variance, New York, 1935. I would ask all of you to please read up this Committee for the Study of Sex Variance. There, if you look up their documents, these are available online. I would refer you to another article which has been recently written. It is called Lesbians Under Medical Gaze. Lesbians Under Medical Gaze. Read this article because this article is also an analysis of the methodology applied by the Committee for the Study of Sex Variance. Now, this was a committee which consisted of, look at the people on them, psychiatrists, gynecologists. Just look at the list. I'm not going to go through the entire list. So you can understand which are the people who came together. The last one, New York City Department of Correction. Come on. New York City Department of Correction, give me a break. So these people came together to create this committee, and what were they doing? It is all on your slide. It was, I just feel so angry when I actually think about the work of the Committee for the Study of Sex Variance, and this became very, very popular across the globe. This actually became very popular. Interviews were conducted and genitalia were researched, people's x-rays were taken, brain shapes were analyzed. They were looking at homosexuality as something which could be determined anatomically, and that was horrible. They did not even consider that sexuality cannot be pinned down to the body. Just see where they've started, and mostly doctors, clinical psychologists. What was going on? Neurologists. And why did they form the committee in the first place? Who told them to do so? Of course, the correctional cells, and they wanted to prevent homosexuality. Otherwise, the family structure was actually going a little, wobbly. In order to keep the family inviolate, can you mention the name of the article? Lesbians Under Medical Gaze. Lesbians Under Medical Gaze. Read it, it's available online. It's one of the Taylor and Francis Journal articles. And this one, the suggested techniques for preventing sex variants were primarily a way to restore heterosexuality. I don't know why they were emphasizing on restoring homosexuality, because as heterosexuality did not go anywhere. Had heterosexuality gone anywhere, we would not be holding this conference anyway. So it was always there, but they wanted, because they thought that the family was being threatened. Because you see, because homosexuality is non-procreative, non-reproductive, it is very difficult to have a bloodline. The family cannot be sustained through a bloodline. And any capitalist society, I'm not really at all surprised that it happened in New York. New York being the hub of capitalism, the central of capitalism, you are very, very interesting that it happened in New York only, where people were talking about this. People were talking about this, oh my God, the family was being threatened by homosexuals. So the wealth I have earned all my life had to be channelized to the next generation through a bloodline. And if I do not have a bloodline, because if I'm a homosexual, if I'm into non-procreative relationship with someone else, then who is going to own that property? Right? Now, surrogacy and all of that came later on. I'm not going to get into the question of surrogacy, but many queer couples, they go for surrogacy. They are more conformist that way. I'm not going to get into that. But the problem in 1935 was this, that homosexuality by any means had to be stopped. And people who were brought together were again these scientists, this journalist and the lawmaker, New York City Department of Correction. I would suggest watch the film Boy Erased. The novel is available. Watch the film Boy Erased. You would know what I'm talking about. Next slide. I'm jumping directly to 1992. In between, I'm not talking about the in-between period. It would have been very interesting. We could have another session on that, because the 60s and the 70s were very pro-homosexual. Today, we are talking about how homosexuality continued to be vilified within medical science syllabi. But today, so you see, this was the time when need for conversion was almost officially established by the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. 3 people founded it, and it promoted conversion therapy across the US. And as I have mentioned, I've highlighted it, pseudo-scientific practice. It is certainly a pseudo-scientific practice. You will be surprised that conversion therapy is still in vogue. It has not been outlawed, and it is, I don't know, like, in India also, it is being practiced very, very widely. Anjana Harish's death very recently, I'm sure you would be, you know this, that it just happened, Anjana Harish's death suddenly made us sit up and realize, oh my God, conversion therapy still happens. I will tell you, I am also a victim of conversion therapy, sitting in Kolkata. So it didn't really, it just continues to happen even today. And today I have a voice, I can talk back, but I always try to think about those who are like very young kids who are taken to these conversion therapists and their lives are ruined. But North is still there. So the point is, so I am stopping with 1992, but I believe I've been able to establish by this time, remember that by 1992 and all of this independence has been achieved and everything, but a colonial mindset surrounding homosexuality has been established, and the syllabi which had entered any discipline was actually directly borrowed from the colonies. It's very recently that we are decolonizing our syllabi. At Jadavpur University, we have started that in a big way. I believe this conversation that we had today would open up that space, would open up that dialogue between this kind of, and what I did today, it would be interesting to you to know, this is a very condensed form of my introductory lecture to my course on queer studies at Jadavpur University. We have introduced a course for queer studies. It was there since I was a student, but now I teach it very interestingly. So there has been, the course has undergone many changes, but today when I teach it, I do it by introducing these slides, talking about these ideas, but in a more elaborate way. These these introductory lectures go on for weeks. But today what I tried to do is condense it a bit and give you a vision, little bit of an understanding that why your textbooks are so heteronormative, why homosexuality is still being treated as a disease, and why we, we are still so homophobic. So the point is, I'm going to stop here. Next slide, Tirthankar, with a slightly positive note. So that was not the end, the beginning really of a conversation that is going to continue for a longer time. And we are still at the starting point in many cultures. The second part meant that in many cultures, we are still to even, begin this conversation. We have not been able to. With that, I'm going to end my presentation. I took a lot of time, I know, but yeah, we can just move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bakshi. That was a very insightful presentation. And I like the way how you have given us the historical emergence of the term homosexuality since 1860 and all, and how Judeo-Christianism, Judeo-Christian dictums and the secular laws in Elizabethan England have what to say? They have paved the way for calling homosexuality as a criminal behavior. And I agree with you that the vilification and the immoralization of homosexuality by the religion and laws has slowly creeped into medical science, and it is still pathologizing homosexuality till this day. Thank you, sir. Thank you for having with us on our session today. Now we will move on to our second speaker. We are pleased to welcome
I think Mahua is having connectivity issues. Our next speaker is Dr. Ketki Ranade. We can also refer to her as KP. So Dr. Ketki has worked for almost a decade as a mental health service provider, researcher and activist, and the research, writing, and teaching is in the areas of mental health, law, policy programs and advocacy, LGBTQ mental health, clinical social work, and research methodology. Ma'am, you can take over now.
Thanks. Roshmi, is it?
Yes.
Thank you, Roshmi. Just at the start, a couple of things. So my legal name is Ketki Ranade. I go by the name KP because I identify as a genderqueer person. That means I don't identify as a woman, which was the gender that was assigned to me at birth. And so...
Oh, I'm so sorry for that.
No problem. No problem. So I use the pronouns they. I don't use the pronoun she either. So yeah, that's just by way of information. If don't worry too much about how you address me. It's important that we connect and have a conversation despite this medium where we can't see each other, etc. But this is just to clarify about my introduction. So Roshmi or Mahua, whoever is here, can you just tell me how much time I have? Accordingly, I will sort of figure out what I do. And also, if you, yeah, so how much time do I have?
It would be good if you can finish in like 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So another thing, Roshmi, if you can just let me know when I have about 3 minutes or 4 minutes left. So I will stay within 20 minutes, yeah?
Okay, okay, yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so just to begin with, what I was told by Doctors for a Cause, and thank you very much for having me here. I have heard Dr. Tirthankar on several occasions. I met him several years ago when I was doing a research study on gay affirmative counseling practices in Kolkata, and was very, very inspired by his work. And so it's wonderful today to be here amongst his students and also to share this panel space with him. So thanks for calling me here. And what I was asked to focus on was about prevalence of conversion therapy and the problems that queer individuals face when they visit a mental health facility. Right? I'll come to, because this question is in two parts. One is the prevalence of conversion treatment, and the other is what happens when queer and trans people go to severely normativizing institutions like mental health care facilities, the clinic, etc. So I'll come to both these questions, but I just want to sort of start from a few things that Dr. Bakshi has where he sort of raised many things for us, and he's left us at one particular point. So I just want to say just within like 2 minutes. I'm not going to focus on that too much, though that's one of the things I love to talk about, which is history of pathologization of sexuality and gender. But I just want to say two things. One is that in Dr. Bakshi's talk, he sort of very, in a strong way, highlighted the fact that with the influence of law and religion, how science did not start as a neutral as a neutral space and did not do its empirical work historically in the 18th century. I just want to sort of take off from there and say that I want to make a statement, and I'm making it responsibly, that science, to my mind, is always a politically, socially, contextually located endeavor. And it cannot be neutral in that sense. And therefore, it will be continued to be influenced by the times we live in. So I just want to say that pathologization of homosexuality or transness, as well as depathologization that happened in the US, the American Psychiatric Association did it in 1973, the WHO followed in much later in 1992. So both these, pathologization and depathologization, were deeply political decisions, and they were not entirely or only, or rather very marginally based on what is called as evidence. Yeah, because evidence can be collected from this side and that side. You can collect evidence to say this is good, and you can collect evidence to say that is bad. Yeah, I just want to point you to two very important, I think, very interesting readings. One is by Zacher and Kendler, and I'll be referring to many people while I speak, and I will put up names of authors and stuff like that at the end of my talk on the chat. So don't worry about that. So Zacher and Kendler wrote this very interesting article where they compared how Pluto as a planet was declassified. It was not a planet anymore. And homosexuality was declassified and not a pathological condition anymore. And in that, he does some very, both these people do some very interesting thing on getting us to think about science itself and scientific authority. This is something that was published in Philosophy, Ethics, and Humanities in Medicine, a journal in 2012. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to, which is something I have written about, another very interesting article written by Sudarshan Kotai. I think Sudarshan is here in the audience. Where we both have also at different places where we both have said that you have in India, you have the psi disciplines, that is psychiatry, psychology, psychiatric social work, and so on, counseling, etc., are so severely influenced by Western medical knowledge. Yeah, so we are very much influenced by the what is being said by the American Psychiatric Association, what is being said by the WHO, and so on. We follow the classificatory systems for mental illnesses that originate from both these places. Despite of that, in 1973 is when homosexuality was depathologized by the APA, and 1992 by the WHO. But in India, despite everything else, so we went by the APA when it came to treatment of schizophrenia. But when it came to looking at homosexuality, we exactly around this time, we continue to use what are called as cure or conversion treatments. Yeah, and somehow it is after 2009 when the Delhi High Court first decriminalized homosexuality. A couple of years later is when we have the first editorial from the Indian Psychiatric Society saying that homosexuality is a normal variant of human sexuality, etc. And then when the courts recriminalize homosexuality in 2013, 2014, the same IPS, the Indian Psychiatric Society, carries a letter to the editor which says that homosexuality is abnormal because it is non-reproductive. Yeah. So I'm saying that in that sense, in our context as well, pathology, whether it's pathology, whether it's not pathology, has been so much influenced by what's happening around, what's happening definitely in the Indian courts, but what's also happening on the streets in terms of what queer rights movements have been saying about some of these issues. So anyway, so having said that, I will go to what I have been asked to talk about, which is about conversion treatments. And again, I will sort of very briefly say that Dr. Bakshi has given us a very good historical sense of what happened from the 18th century onwards. I just want to briefly say a little bit about the history of conversion treatments itself. And we know that as early as, so in fact, as early as sort of early 1900s, we know about, I'm just going to show you one small little thing here. I hope you're able to see this. In this book, which is called The Origins of Organ Transplantation, Surgery and Laboratory Science in 1880s to 1930, this is one of the places where we hear for the first time about surgical treatments for homosexuality. So conversion treatments as we know them today, and as we sort of, as we talk about banning them, etc., go back to as early 1900s. And initially conversion treatments are very much surgical in nature, primarily because they are responding to what at that point of time was seen as, where was the pathology. So in the book that I just showed you, you have a mention of what is called as unilateral castration and transplantation of testicular tissue from a heterosexual man into a homosexual man, and where what was believed was that homosexuality is actually something that is, so they talked about having observed signs of female germ cells in the testicles of a homosexual patient. And so therefore they said that, okay, the disease is located here, which is in the genitals. And so we'll have to do some kind of a sort of transplant surgeries, and that will cure homosexuality. And we know between 1916 to 1921, 11 such men were operated upon. Later on in the early, 1960s again, Germany, we hear about this theory that the hypothalamus of homosexual men is longer than that of heterosexual men. And so we hear about a surgical intervention called as hypothalamotomy, which I think about 75 surgeries happened in the 1960s. Dr. Bakshi has already talked about Freud, and I want to say that psychoanalysis is again a very important influence in this history of conversion treatments for homosexuality, because till psychoanalysis in some ways and sort of the influence that increases, till then we were looking at homosexuality as being located as a pathology that was located in the genitals or in the brain, and accordingly we were carrying on treatments. With psychoanalysis, what happens is that the whole theory of mind and psyche comes at the center stage. So we move now from the body to the mind. And specifically within psychoanalysis, you have somebody called Bieber in 1962, who does this famous study, which basically talks about family pathology as the cause for homosexuality. And this idea of family pathology is something that you see as influencing conversion treatment ideas even now. So it's a very long-standing sort of an idea which has had a solid life. So what did Bieber say? He said that homosexuality was caused in men primarily because they had domineering and over-involved mothers, and they had cold and distant fathers. So these men were basically sort of seeking their father's approval and love all their life by chasing other men. And yeah, so that's sort of a little bit on psychoanalysis. And then you have within psychology, Western psychology, you have this huge shift towards, or rather the influence of behaviorism saying that, let's talk about neutral science again. That thing that I said earlier does not exist. But so what behaviorism tries to do is they tell you that all this psychoanalysis and all this stuff is so interpretive. What we will focus on is all that can be empirically observed and empirically measured. And so then with the behaviorists come what are called as learning theories. And briefly, just to say that the behaviorists then tell you that homosexuality is faulty learning. And if it is faulty learning, it can be unlearned. Yeah, and the behaviorist version of conversion treatments, whether it is through NARTH that Dr. Bakshi was mentioning, or through a range of other things, is the most popular form of conversion treatments as they exist even now. So these are behavioral interventions where people are told that, so gay men, if they want to learn to become heterosexual, then they are told that they need to be, so they might start masturbating, thinking about a man's body, and just before a climax, they sort of shift that image to a woman's body. It gets much more intrusive in terms of what are called as aversion treatments, where you might be given electric shock. So aversion therapy is basically where a gay man is shown nude pictures of men and pictures of women. When you're seeing a nude picture of a woman, you're not administered a shock, but when you're seeing a nude picture of a man, you're administered a shock. The idea being that you'll make an association between this, between sort of sexual arousal towards a particular kind of sexual stimulus, which is the male body, and you'll develop aversion to that kind of arousal. And we of course can see the huge problems with these kinds of treatments. So that was just to give you a little bit of history, which I must say I was very inspired by Dr. Bakshi to go into that, which is not my brief today. But okay, I've spent about 4 to 5 minutes going there. Now I'll just talk a little bit about the thing that I was told to talk about, which is prevalence of conversion therapy today in a contemporary sort of sense. Again, to draw from one of the things that Dr. Bakshi said, which is about the need to ask right questions. Yeah? And to my mind, the question of prevalence of conversion therapy today is not a very right question. And I'll say why. One is because today, in a all of us in living in post 2018 Supreme Court's wonderful judgment on 377 that is decriminalized homosexuality, living in a world where the media and the corporates and everyone wants to be supportive of the LGBTQ cause, it's unlikely that you're going to get anything if you want to ask the question on prevalence of conversion treatments. Primarily because it's not so. For example, Anjana Harish was mentioned, and after that, you must be aware that several associations of mental health professionals in India came up with a statement saying that we want to ban conversion treatments. And so it's unlikely that in my association, let's say there are 1,000 members, 500 people are going to say that, we do conversion treatments. Yeah. So in that sense, prevalence is something that's not going to get us too far. But we know that if you were to, that there are several people, several doctors who have these YouTube channels and Facebook pages and so on, where they're very openly talking about how they can cure and change. And it's interesting to see the language. I was just before coming in for the seminar, I was looking at this Liberate and Practo and some of these places. And Liberate, I found some interesting things. So you had sexologists and psychiatrists saying that, and I can quote here, that homosexuality is a personal preference, not a deviance. So you're thinking, okay, great, so no conversion treatment. But then the next line says, if you're willing to change your preference, please consult a sex therapist. Yeah. Or another one, no treatment for homosexuality. But counseling and cognitive therapy may help. This is an anti-natural way of having sex, can cause AIDS, unlike normal sex with your wife. Yeah. So here you have the idea of, so today I think the reason I'm saying that this prevalence question is not a great one is because what's going to happen is that it happens, and it happens today. People have learned that it's politically and hopefully soon legally incorrect to engage in these kinds of harmful treatments. The other thing is, of course, that recently I was doing the online training, and I spoke to a professional who was saying that, a mental health professional, who was saying, I don't engage in conversion treatment. Yeah, that's a bad thing. But if someone is willing to, I want to help them. Yeah. So this idea of, if a family has this, this one child, gay boy, lesbian woman, whatever, bisexual person, somebody who's saying, I want to get married. If I can help this family, the family will be happy. This person will also be happy eventually, because they will be able to, so this guy may be able to have a wife and a child and someone who look after them in their old age and etc. Right? So coming from a place of, I would like to help. Yeah. So if you ask this person, do you engage in conversion treatment? That person is going to say that, no, I don't. Right. So again, so more than thinking about prevalence of conversion treatment, I think it might be useful for us to go back and ask that, what is it that makes doctors and mental health professionals believe that I am being of help and I am being of service. Yeah. And here again, you have this very interesting study that was done in UK on oral histories of patients and professionals who engaged in conversion treatment way back in the 50s and 60s. And all the professionals there say that we thought we were doing a good thing. We thought we were helping. Yeah. And so similarly, again, if you look at the suicide, the death by suicide of Anjana Harish, again, there you see the same thing, that the version that you hear from the family and from the doctors, which is also gone quite widely in media everywhere, is to say that what happened with Anjana was that she was being treated for her depression and she was being treated for her addiction. Yeah. This was not conversion treatment. This was not, we were not trying to cure her bisexuality. Yeah. And in fact, in mental health practice, it is not unusual for people to be treated against their will. Yeah. So I'm saying this conversion business is a little tricky. It's become more and more tricky in today's times. The other two questions that I want to sort of quickly address around conversion treatment. One, I feel, is again a case of yeah, sorry, I'm just distracted by some messages. But yeah, one thing I feel that happens, that has happened with us, many of us for a very long time around conversion treatment, is that we spend too much time disputing the efficacy of conversion treatment. Yeah, so many of us, including I have done research studies like this, where we have tried to say that, how does conversion treatment work? What is your idea of success? What do you convert? What do you achieve? Yeah, and of course we were told that people get married. Yeah, and so I was told by a sexologist that I treated him for 3 months, and a year later he came with a box of sweets and with a baby in his hand. Yeah, and does this say anything about whether the homosexuality went away, whether desire went away, whether orientation went away, whether even the sexual behaviors went away? What we know possibly is that new sexual behaviors were added. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time doing this kind of, what is efficacy of conversion treatment and trying to sort of challenge that it is not really converting people's sexual orientation. The other thing we did was, some of us who were sort of methodologically inclined were also asking questions like, when they said 30% success rate and things like that. So we said, who was there in your study? And to begin with, if you had behaviorally bisexual people in your study, and then you're saying that they have become, they are also engaging in heterosexual sex after 6 months of treatment, then what is this efficacy and so on. But I think, again, that was the reason I say that was a wrong question, is because I think much later we started asking the right question about conversion treatment, which is that of asking, what is the harm that conversion treatment causes? And it causes immense harm. Just think about, Anjana's story comes to mind because it is just something that has affected all of us so much recently. But just think about, you come out to your family and then they put you against your wish into two psychiatric institutions. One where you're put in a solitary confinement, you're put in with people who have chronic severe mental illness, you're given medication which you don't know what they're about, and all of that. And we know, of course, that Anjana makes this Facebook video in March, and then we know later in May she dies by suicide. So it's after we've started asking this question that we have now begun to say that conversion treatments lead to suicides, lead to serious self-harm, serious degradation of self, a sense of shame, and increases internalized homonegativity, increases self-loathing, causes other kinds of mental health issues and depression and so on. Yeah. So I think those are very, very important things to be looking at as far as conversion treatment is concerned. Having said that, I also want to say one more thing before I go to the second part of the question, which was about what happens to queer people when they get into mental health services. The other thing I want to say about conversion treatment or about depathologization of homosexuality is that, even if we ban conversion treatments legally, I already said that there will still be families and there will be still queer individuals who will say that I don't want to live this life and I don't want to be doing this and I want to change. So I just want to say that we will have to actually, if we want to seriously sort of change, seriously mean this, that homosexuality is not pathology. And I'm right now talking only about homosexuality. I'll talk about gender and transness in a bit. But I think if we seriously want to shift this, then the question in our curriculum, in our clinics, in our supervision is not just to say that this is not disorder, this is not mental disorder anymore. We have to actually start looking at how do our disciplines look at gender sexuality. And in my discipline, when I look at the side disciplines, I see that homosexuality went out of the book a while ago. The DSM very proudly said that we don't anymore consider gender identity disorder as a disorder. We are going to talk about is gender dysphoria. And so we are now focused more on the dysphoria and not on the disorder. And so we are depathologizing. But I just want to say that in the discipline, in these disciplines, side disciplines, how is gender sexuality looked at? And I want those of us here who are familiar with the DSM, the current one, the DSM-5 or the ICD-10, I would urge you to look at sections in these classificatory systems, sections that talk about disorders of sexual preference, sections that talk about paraphilias. And what we see there is actually pathologization of a lot of non-penovaginal, non-heterosexual sex. Yeah. So on one level, there has been a lot of political pressure, legal pressure, changes socially, which have led to depathologization of one thing called as homosexuality or one thing called as gender identity disorder. That doesn't really mean that non-normative genders and sexualities are not pathologized. Yeah. So I just want to say that in that sense, yes, it's a great thing that homosexuality is, at least on paper, not seen as mental disorder. It is a wonderful thing that today you have many, many associations saying that this is not a disorder, it can't be cured and should not be attempted to be cured. And yet I feel that our work is much, much deeper, which is the deeper work is to actually ask critical questions of disciplines like medicine, like psychology, like psychiatry, like juridical disciplines, like like law, and so on. We have to ask questions of how is normative gender sexuality constructed. And I think that's where sort of we should be focused on. Moving to the next bit of what I was asked to do, which is what happens to queer people when they go to mental health services. And to quickly sort of, how much time do I have, Roshmi? Or
about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, right, thanks.
Yeah.
I think I will finish in about 5 or maybe 2 extra minutes, yeah? Okay, so what happens to queer people in this context when we go to seek mental health services? So one is, of course, there is the idea of, many of us must have read about compulsory heterosexuality. There's this idea of the world is full of cisgender people and heterosexual people, yeah? And so if I am someone who's not cis or who's not het, then I have to, it is my job to make myself visible to my therapist or to my psychiatrist or to my counselor, yeah? Which means I am depressed. I have to first figure out whether I will come out to my counselor. If my problem is, if I want to be able to really talk about what's going on with me, I would like to be able to be authentic in this therapy session. So then it's my job to find out whether it's safe to come out to this particular person, to find a space where I can be, safely be talked about. Otherwise, of course, if I don't do that coming out job, then what's going to happen is I'm going to be treated like a cishet person. So everything that applies to a cishet life is going to be transposed into my life. Yeah. So in terms of, so I'm going to be probably seen at the age of 40 plus as single, because if I was asked, are you married? I'm going to say no. But that does not say anything really about my relationship status, right? So yeah, so then it's my job to come out. Often, let's say that I come out and it's a safe space. It's also often my job in the mental health system to educate my doctor or my counselor or my therapist about my life and about people like me and about our kinds of relationships. Yeah. So one of the major problems when people go to any of these clinic facilities is that they are faced with invisibility. They have to visualize themselves. The other thing, of course, is that while there is invisibility, there is stereotype. Stereotype is present in a big way, right? So you have the stereotype of the gay man who's promiscuous and therefore at risk for sexually transmitted illnesses. You have the stereotype of the lesbian woman who is macho and hypermasculinized. You have the stereotype of the trans woman who is hyperfeminine. So I have this one friend who had gone to a psychiatrist to get her certificate for gender dysphoria to be able to go ahead with her transition. And one of the things, so the psychiatrist said to her that you don't appear feminine enough to me. And in your next session, if you could wear a sari or a salwar kurta, because she was wearing jeans and t-shirt, yeah. So he was not convinced of her gender dysphoria because she was not the stereotype of the hyper-feminine trans woman that he had in his mind. I mean, again, so think about this, that many doctors use the idea of gender dysphoria certificate. What is there to certify? Gender is something I will decide. I will give my certificate to myself. Yeah, I will say that I'm genderqueer. I'm genderqueer. Period. Yeah. So the WPATH, for example, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, says something where they say that if I need to undergo medical transition, I will have to go to a therapist, a psychologist, a counselor, or a psychiatrist, and I will have to, sort of get what is called as a letter of support from them, where they will provide a lot of information. They will help me work through what transition can mean socially, what does it mean, whether I have money, whether I have support, post-op care, whole lot of things like that. So it's supposed to be a letter of support, but what ends up in clinical practice end up being about certification. The other last thing I want to say at this stage, and hopefully we will have more conversations later, is that all of the psychological theories and therapy models and counseling models and all that, they all suffer from this thing which is called as cisgenderness and heterosexuality. Okay, so let's say if you look at couple therapy and family therapy, yeah, it has its own notions of what a couple is and what a family is. Yeah, so if I'm someone who is, for example, I always say this to when I'm doing trainings with mental health professionals, I always say this, that the cis het socialization that we have had, and I'm not saying now about training, I'm saying our own socialization, yeah, within our own families and what we see around and in our pop culture and all of that, and then in our training, we think about families in a certain way. Yeah, if you want to work with queer and trans clients in any meaningful way, you have to have one major reference point, that for many people, families are sites of violence, spaces from where they want to run away. So they are not your psychology textbook idea of children who receive nurturance here, and then children have this great pain when they are developing their own identity. They have to individuate and they have to launch out from this wonderful family's bosom. Very often the launching out for queer and trans kids is terribly violent. It is a serious psychological rupture, psychic rupture, to move away from families, sometimes to never want to come back at all. And this is a very, very important experiential theme for many trans people, many queer people, many gender non-conforming young people. And if we want to in any meaningful way engage with young queer people, we must be able to sort of take a look at all these ideas. And so I gave you the example of individuation, and I have very little time, but I'm also going to say this, that the idea of the attachment itself, of the mother-child bond and the parent and the child bond, yeah, for someone who's gender non-conforming, from very, very early on in life, they find it difficult to find mirrors in their parents who are mirroring their gendered realities to them. Yeah, so the very attachment itself may not be formed in order for the later, sort of launching out and all that has to happen. So yeah, so there are several such ideas that come within therapeutic models, whether they are about this integrated whole authentic self of the queer person is only that person who is out and who's out and proud. And I have sort of written about this in my book, where I say that, those of us who are not out are not necessarily living terribly lonely, depressed lives. People may not be out for a range of situated contextual reasons, not because intrapsychically they are troubled. Yeah, so similarly, the idea of what is a stable family, what is a stable relationship. Yeah, so stable, emotionally stable relationship is that one partner forever type of idea. This idea of you fall in love and then you sort of die together or grow old together or whatever that might be. So yeah, so that's the second thing I wanted to talk about. I do want to say a little bit about trans realities, but I think maybe in the second round, if we do have chance, because what I was told is that there are also some case studies that speakers will be asked to respond to. So I will stop at this point. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't overshoot time too much.
Thank you, Dr. Ranade. That was a very stimulating speech. And thank you for sharing all the experiences that you have witnessed in your professional life. Okay. Now we would move on to our next speaker, Dr. Tirthankar Guha Thakurta. Dr. Guha Thakurta is a very popular name among the medical students. He is an MD Physiology and a teaching faculty at KPC Medical College and Hospital, Kolkata, a filmmaker and a queer rights activist. And now he would be giving us his expert opinion about the visibility of LGBTQ plus issues in medical curriculum and campus. I now hand over the mic to you, sir.
Thank you, Mohua. This is one topic that I have been talking to my students, to other faculty members and other institutions time over again. So, Mohua, why, when you ask me the question of queer visibility in a campus, for that matter, it's very difficult to comment on that because the word queer is probably not known to most of the medicos. They are not aware of the queer vocabularies as well. So it's in a very ignorant stage, in a very primitive stage, and a stage at which the ignorance leads to more discrimination. Now, if you ask me about why it is so important, why am I so obsessed about the medical curriculum being so phobic, as very wonderfully pointed out by my previous speakers, you understand that with the medical degree that you are getting, you are awarded some kind of power. And if you do not have the responsibility to use that power in a judicious way, that can be disastrous. So I'm not saying that people in the other professions are not as powerful, but people who are in the realm of healthcare and law, they have the ability to easily brand someone as normal and abnormal, as legal and illegal. So there is a lot of labeling power, of museumizing power that you have with a particular degree that you acquire from the medical school. Now, I have been teaching medical students for a long time. There is one thing that might not sound good, but this is true. What I find is that the kind of medical curriculum that we follow here also has a huge amount of colonial hangover. So we don't teach them to become medical scientists. We teach them to become a kind of doctor that the state wants us to become. So there should be a time in the year when some brand new brains based on their merits will get into the college. Then they will be trained to become the kind of production that the state wants to make and will go out at a particular point of time. So the production of doctor is more akin to a production house where you get similar units of commodities or modalities of mass consumption being made. So the problem that we face with the medical curriculum or the scientific curriculum as such is, although which is supposed to be an inquisitive subject, a subject that questions its own terms and existence and reevaluates time and again, medical science tends to be a very convergent subject where all opinions must converge to one common opinion. It is not very open to the multiplicity of normality, the existence of multiple truths simultaneously. That is not what is very much encouraged in a medical school. Maybe from a very practice point of view, having different algorithms running parallelly may be a workplace error. But what I fail to understand is that technology does not always have to be an essential byproduct of science. Science can have its own questions, and the question may not make sense in a utilitarian world where everything is ultimately cut down to the point of what is the point of asking this question. The point of asking the question can be the question itself. So let us see what kind of curriculum we do have, what do we teach, or what are we forced to teach in the boundaries of the curriculum. Mohua or Roshmi, can you please share the PowerPoint slide that I gave you?
Yes, so one sec. So is it visible?
Okay. Yes, it is visible. So this is also actually a very abridged and brief version of what I presented before, also in TIS Mumbai and also in one of the events organized by Sappho for Equality. You see, the kind of thing that I'm talking about, next slide, please. In the medical campus, you will not believe, but the campus tends to be a very heterosexual, heteronormative campus in general. there has been, I'm just reading out a statement by Dr. Mark Skuster, who is the head of general pediatrics in Children's Hospital, Boston. He says that there is a constant struggle to choose between being a doctor and being openly gay. And this is the reality in India as well. Now, if you read these lines again and again, the prose is actually very riveting. It's very difficult to read because you understand that it gives a very even-handed description of a profession which is there, which is out there for helping others, is itself incapable of treating some of their own member as their own. So you see the use and the misuse of the power here. Being a doctor gives you the power to label someone as abnormal, and using that power, your colleagues can call you abnormal and deem you unfit to become a doctor. And this is the vicious cycle that goes on in the campus. So a queer teacher has to outprove or excel in such a manner that the negativity of being queer is in some way compensated by some other attributes. And the same holds true for the students as well. Next slide, please. So what is the structure of the MBBS course for those who are not from a MBBS background? If you see, in the first year, we teach the quote unquote normal structure, function, and chemistry of the body. That comes under the purview of anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry. In the second part of the course, we discuss the quote unquote abnormalities or aberrations related to this. So we teach pathology, the drugs, pharmacology, the microbes under microbiology, and the interface of law and medicine under forensic medicine. The third part of the MBBS course, which is the clinical part of the MBBS course, deals with the different clinical disciplines like eye, ENT, community medicine, general medicine, surgery, gynecology, obstetrics, and pediatrics. This is followed by 1 year of a rotating internship in all the departments to gain more practical knowledge. Next slide, please. Now see, so in the first year, maybe the most logical introduction to gender and sexuality can happen when we are discussing the normal functions of the body. But if you see the presence of sexuality and gender in the physiology curriculum, you will see that there is not a single mention about the difference between gender and sex. There is absolutely no discussion on sexual orientation, homosexuality, or bisexuality. Even the word heterosexual is not mentioned. It's taken to be default. That is more problematic. And there is absolutely no discussion on gender identity. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of the a page of the physiology syllabus proposed by the West Bengal University of Health Sciences. You do not have to read it thoroughly. What I'm trying to show here is that there is a system called reproductive system. So you understand that the whole genital or the sexual system has been reduced down to heterosexual procreation, which is not only very derogatory and a narrow view of health and the politics of health, but to be very honest, it's very derogatory for cisgendered, heterosexual, reproductive individuals as well. Statistically speaking, a lady can ovulate, say, 450 to 500 times in the reproductive years. A man can ejaculate millions of sperms every day, but only a few of them fertilize to become the zygote and form the children. So if we believe in the kind of two-child norm that India is proposing now, imagine the hundreds of ovum and the trillions and quadrillions of spermatozoa that have flown out of the body, giving pleasure, causing physiological changes in the brain and the body, but never reproduced. So even statistically, it is not justified to focus the whole study of human physiology and pleasure into a procreative domain and reducing the study of the entire human sexual system into a cisgender heteronormative reproductive system. That is absolutely not acceptable. Now, next slide, please. If I quote a very seminal book on medical physiology, which is often treated as one of the best books in medical physiology, you see how they are describing changes in puberty. So changes in puberty in the boys, next slide, please. There will be a highlight coming in. Yeah. So the mental changes are explicitly said as that the boys have to be more aggressive, more active attitude. I do not even know what that means, and interest in opposite sex. So you understand that the aggression, which is very much a behavioral component and not something to be very much proud of, probably most of the times, it has been already validated on physiological ground. So if a boy hits you, he can validate it by saying, I am a boy and physiologically I am supposed to be aggressive. Also, the interest in opposite sex being the only attribute of puberty makes the boy essentially heterosexual. So homosexual people either do not have puberty or their puberty is not a concern of the study of physiology. And these thoughts have been percolated into the Indian small books that students often read for passing examination, and a similar thing has been echoed. In one of the very popular books, next slide please, in one of the very popular books that students often read to pass examination, you will see that there is only one line in the whole textbook where the word same sex is mentioned. And the line reads about damage in the brain. When a part of the brain has been experimentally damaged, it causes a syndrome called the Clover syndrome. And this has been described to be identified by excessive sexual urge, often mounting animals of the same sex. So you see the kind of derogation the word same sex has. So either it does not appear in the textbook, or the only context in which it appears in the textbook is in the context of a brain damage. It's sufficient to damage the brain already, I think. So next slide, please. So with this kind of a very debatable introduction to same-sex intimacy, when the student who has not considered homosexuality as normal in the textbooks, because the textbook never mentioned it, goes to the second year, which is supposed to be the year in which diseases are going to be taught, that is when formally the topic homosexuality comes into play. Luckily, pathology does not pathologize it, but the subject of forensic medicine does. Next slide, please. In forensic medicine, which is an interface between law and medical science, when the students are taught about sexual offenses, you see the sexual offenses are divided into natural offenses, unnatural offenses, and sexual perversions. Now, this is something very interesting in a very bad way. You can see that rape is natural. So as long as it is penovaginal and heterosexual in content, even though an offense, it can be a natural offense. On the other hand, even if consensual, sodomy or buccal coitus will be unnatural offense. And this reminds me of Dr. Bakshi's mention of John Disney's write-up, A View of Ancient Laws Against Immorality and Profaneness. You can see the list of sexual perversions where in the same list, you get exhibitionism, you get masturbation, you get voyeurism, you get sadism, masochism, and in the same chapter, you get homosexuality or sodomy, you get buccal coitus, blah, blah, blah. So this is how actually history influences the present, how our mindsets are preconditioned to what is normal and what is abnormal. Next slide, please. So see, this is one page from that book where they are writing about the Hijra community, and I really do not know what is the source of this information. In India, a class of male prostitutes called eunuchs act as passive agents in sodomy. They are of two groups, Hijra and Zenana. I have never heard of this kind of classification. The Hijras are those who have been castrated, usually before puberty, and the genitalia of the Zenana are intact. For the audience who wants to read more about the Hijra community, there are wonderful texts. You can also read the book Human Rights Violation Against the Transgender Community that is published by the People's Union for Civil Liberties by Karnataka. So that is something I think you should read to get rid of this kind of misconceptions. Next slide, please. See, this is what the book has to talk about same-sex love between females. And you also see how I'm going to read between the lines, and sometimes it's an overt expression of ignorance. Female homosexuality is also known as tribadism or lesbianism. By the way, tribadism is a specific act, and it is not lesbianism per se. Many lesbians are masculine in type. You see where sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expressions are getting thoroughly confused. possibly because of endocrine disturbances. There is no reference for the text. This is one of the imaginative kind of thought experiments that the authors do. And this is the power display that I'm talking of. You have been granted a qualification based on your study of the normative heterosexual medicine. This does not make you qualified to comment or theorize without evidence what might be the cause of homosexuality. But you are misusing your power because you have a qualification. And this appeal to authority is always there in the medical education. The power play, the hierarchy of not being able to speak against the professor, treating whatever the books and the professors say as gospel, has been one of the cornerstones in the practice of the study of medicine, which will actually, it's ruining the popularity of the study. You say, see, the next line says the practice is usually indulged in by women. And then comes the hypothesis, who are mental degenerates, or those who suffer from nymphomania. And then comes another kind of expression, again not supported by any references, lesbians who are morbidly jealous of one another when rejected may commit homicide, suicide, or both. I really do not know what is the aim of this and how can this be taught in a scientific community. Now, the fact is, even if a teacher does not teach this, the book has it written. So the child has an access to reading this. And when the child reads this, and because the book is considered to be seminal, so you understand that this kind of biased idea become notions of normality and standard medical practice to most of the people. Next slide, please. So section 377 of IPC, I'm not going to talk about that. All of us know about it. But even after the reading down of the section is very prominently written in most of the textbooks of forensic medicine, and questions are asked on this. Next, please. Now see another kind of theorization that happens in the book without evidence or reference. Homosexuality means persistent emotional and physical attraction to members of the same sex. I do not personally have any problem with this line. The problem comes with the next line. As such, it is an abnormal personality development. Now, Dr. Bakshi has wonderfully spoken about the Freudian dilemma. Can you see the dilemma being continued here? It is exactly what the Freudian dilemma is about. So you start with a line that is apparently neutral, then you theorize something and complicate that with your own opinion. And then the author also describes how a medical examiner can identify a passive and an active agent of sodomy by examining the anus and penis. I do not even know how that can be done, and the common element in both being the presence of sexually transmitted disease. Remember, this is also the year when microbiology is going to be taught. And in the study of microbiology, next slide, please. Many Indian textbooks that are read by the students mention a 3H club, which is more prone to HIV. And the 3H club includes homosexuals, Hawaiians, and hemophiliacs. I'll take some pause. My pulse rate is racing. Now, also, the mention of gay sex as a risk factor for sexually transmitted infection and HIV continues because it is not unprotected sex or forms of sex that expose to mucosal damage, etc., that are explicitly mentioned as risk factors of STI or HIV. It is gay sex which is a risk factor for STI and HIV. Although in the Indian statistics, the major percentage of individuals who are HIV positive are heterosexual. And this is totally based on a government study, the NACO study. Okay, so next slide, please. Then we come to the subject called community medicine, also known as the preventive and social medicine. Now, this subject, in a way, collaborates with the social dynamics of medicine, and it's actually a very good subject. It can be a very good starting point of discussion of sexuality and gender. However, the language of the book and the connotations make it very difficult to approach positively. In these books, the words homosexual, MSM, that is men who have sex with men, and high-risk population, these are used interchangeably. Understanding that a statistical parameter or subcategory cannot be the identity of an individual is very important. When you use words like MSM or men who have sex with men, it instead of the epidemiological ideologies, it only reinforces the belief that these people are men who only have sex with men and have nothing else to do. Sexuality is definitely a very important part of someone's identity, but without their permission, we cannot make that the whole of their identity. Next slide, please. Medicine and pediatric books are usually updated. Either they don't mention about sexuality or they mention in a positive way. But some books are there in India which still use words like gay bowel syndrome. Next slide, please. Now coming to the psychiatry part of the syllabus of medicine and pediatrics. Mahua, can we have the next slide, please? Yes. You see, in endocrinology, maybe you can click once more, yeah. The only mention of sexuality is under disorders of sex and reproduction. Next slide, please. In the whole of the psychiatry domain, the only mention of sexuality is sexual dysfunction and puerperal psychosis. So you understand that the whole study of sexuality is largely based on dysfunctions, malfunctions, aberrations, derogations. The discussion of healthy sexuality, sexuality as a component of health, is not discussed in the medical curriculum. Next slide, please. There are some Indian psychiatric books which also tell us how to cure a homosexual individual. So, Mahua, can we have the next slide, please? Yes, this one only. So these are the ways to treat a homosexual individual. And that is what an Indian psychiatry textbook is saying. By psychoanalytic psychotherapy, by behavior therapy like aversion therapy, by supportive psychotherapy, and by androgen therapy. It has been proved decades ago that hormones have no role in determining a person's sexual orientation. Next slide, please. A very seminal textbook in medicine is Harrison's Principle of Internal Medicine. It's a book that remains politically correct, so it never mentions homosexuality as a disorder, but it also never mentions it as normal. So what I did was I did a PDF search with keywords. When I did a search with the words homosexuality in the entire text of Harrison, the only context or the chapter where the word homosexuality occurred in the textbook is in the context of HIV, sexually transmitted infection, Kaposi's sarcoma, anal cancer, hepatitis B, and syphilis. So you can understand the kind of association it builds between a particular sexuality and the health of the individual. Next slide, please. Now, as a teacher, I believe that either you improve the pedagogical techniques, make it more fluid so that the syllabus can be changed, or you make it a practice to teach the or include the variations of sexuality in the syllabus. Now, in the kind of colonial education system that we are used to, students mostly read those topics that are repeated in examination, that are considered to be important topics. In the last 15 years, I have not seen a single question set on sexuality or gender identity in physiology, medicine, psychiatry, and pediatrics. However, forensic medicine has continued to ask questions on section 377, sexual perversions and lesbianism. So you can see the emphasis that is being given by the curriculum. Also remember that there are queer students who are studying this, and to get marks, they have been forced to write that they are part of an aberration or a deviation. Next slide, please. So what all are we not taught in the words? We are not taught in the words how to address queer individuals, how to address in a gender neutral language. In which word, male or female, should we admit a gender non-conformative or trans person? Or whether we should extend the definition of genderizing the words. The concept of gender neutral washrooms, the regional and vernacular vocabulary of the LGBTQ identities, these are never taught. And next slide, please. There is a lot of politics that goes on with the dress code of doctors. So Many teachers think that the doctors must dress up in a particular way, and this dress up is actually a reflection of a very British or a colonial kind of dressing sense. If you dress otherwise, you can actually be punished by being thrown out of the class or by being given less marks because they deserve those less marks. Next slide, please. So, when a person is queer and when dress remains one of the ways by which the queerness can be expressed, what we find is that there is a thoroughly unwritten and unauthorized medical code of dressing, personally imposed by normative teachers. It represents a colonial hangover. There is a gross disparity between the male and the female dressing code. Like if a female can wear salwar kameez, a male cannot wear kurta pajama. If a female can wear sari, a male cannot wear dhoti. I'm not even saying a male can wear sari. They can't even comprehend that probably. There is no recognition of queer identity or dressing, and anyone dressing otherwise is openly humiliated. The last slide, please. So I believe that as teachers and as students of medicine, we have these challenges in front of us. How can we introduce LGBTQ topics in our class? One of the methods that I follow in my class is making it very circumstantial when talking about issues that embrace gender sexuality, to not only focus on the heteronormative domain, but extend the discussion in a very casual way, in a normalized way, to demusamize the whole concept of sexuality, not considering that to be specimens or case studies to be dealt with. We can make textbooks queer friendly, and the one way of doing that is probably to self-author textbooks. We can also encourage the treatment of individuals irrespective of gender and sexuality. So the mode of conversation, the mode of dealing with the patient has to be changed. And the classrooms have to be made more inclusive and welcoming, where we don't judge the students by who they are anatomically or physiologically, but who they are as individuals whom we are dealing with. So these are the challenges we have, and there's a lot of work to be done here. So Mahua, this was my initial presentation, and this might invite a few questions. So in the second half, I'll be taking up those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your enlightening speech. Hello, am I audible and visible as well?
Yes, you're very much audible. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sure, sir, that this will be an eye-opener for so many medical students and doctors and other non-medicals too who are attending today's webinar, that how much heterosexism is ingrained in the MBBS syllabus, and why homophobia is rampant in the healthcare setup. We will be discussing some case studies now, which are based on experiences of queer individuals while they visited the healthcare setups. I would like to ask Roshmi to share their presentation.
Yeah, just a second.
The first case study is for Dr. Kostav Bakshi. Dr. Bakshi, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I'm there. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm reading it out now.
Yes, sure.
A 22-year-old medical student who identifies as a trans woman and who was then in the process of transitioning recalls a day in her anatomy class when she was thrown out of the class by her professor for getting her nose pierced. There had been several incidents of her getting mocked by many of her batchmates over her flamboyancy. She complains that attending college and facing these bullies almost every day, coupled with the absence of support groups at college, has made her life difficult. What is your take on the necessity of queer affirmative behavior on campus, and how do we induce such behavior? Over to you, Dr. Bakshi.
All right. Yeah. See, the question is, what is your take on the necessity of queer affirmative behavior? Mohua and the others who are listening to me, it's a problem is so deep that in order to affirm queer affirmative behavior, what is necessary is a complete change of mindset. First and foremost, I would go back to where Dr. Gothakurta was referring to the idea of dress codes in the medical classroom. Now, the point is that the mistake that we make is that clothes cannot be gendered, first and foremost. This 22-year-old medical student, a trans woman, who is perhaps, wearing a nose ring or anything, the problem is that why would we associate inanimate objects such as a nose ring or a ear stud or a necklace or a piece of clothing with gender? This is so deeply ingrained in our minds that clothes actually reveal more than they hide. You see the irony of the situation that the clothes are actually revealing your sex rather than hiding it. So if you have the anatomical body of a man, then certain clothes would suit you, any other forms of clothes would not suit you. So to develop queer affirmative behavior, you can say that a revolution needs to be kind of organized, is about degendering clothes. Clothes need to be degendered. There is no point. Tell me something. Do you associate any gender with your study table? Do you associate any gender maybe with the door of your house or the walls of your house? If you are not associating any gender with these inanimate objects, why would clothes, inanimate objects, would be gendered? Can't clothes be more fluid? Can't clothes be more androgynous? So the queer affirmative behavior can be affirmed on campus if this degendering can happen. I know it is extremely difficult, in medical science, particularly thinking beyond the non-binary, thinking beyond the binary of the man and the woman is very difficult. So everybody is kind of judged by the anatomical body, but what needs to be understood is that the anatomical body is just a physical manifestation of a body. The body is much more than that. The body, what we need to look at as a social body, the cultural body, the emotional body, that cannot be pinned down to the binary opposition between man and woman. So how do you induce queer affirmative behavior? Is one way is by challenging the idea of clothing. I think what Dr. Gothakurta just pointed out, it is very important that it's not just about dressing in a colonial way. It is also about endorsing that, well, a shirt is male and a skirt is a female. Ironically, the shirt and the skirt both have the same etymological root. If you look at if you look at phonology, if you look at linguistics, they will tell you that the shirt and the skirt have the same etymological root, yet the shirt indicates a certain kind of a gendered apparel and the skirt indicates another form of gendered apparel. So why? So clothes need to be degendered in this, and so what I'm referring to is a deeper problem. It cannot change overnight. So the idea of instituting the sense of the non-binary, which is beyond the biological anatomical body. It is about the emotional body, which cannot be seen, which cannot be concretized, which cannot be, understood in maybe say in biomedical terms. So once that kind of a sense that the body exists beyond the anatomical body, if that kind of an idea can be instituted, I believe that's one. And another thing, this revolution of wearing each other's clothes. And also I do not believe in the word cross-dressing, because the moment I say cross-dressing, I'm also subscribing to the fact that I know there is a male kind of a dress and there is a female kind of a dress. Because you believe that there is a male kind of a dress, so when you dress up like a female, then you think that, oh, okay, fine, then I am cross-dressing. No, you're not cross-dressing. You're just, wearing another object just to cover your body. So dress, clothes, apparel should be fluid. If you can institute that idea, I believe in this particular case, some clear light of day can be seen, but I'm sure that this is a very difficult task to do. So that's what I would like to say. I don't know, like, this is my take on this. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bakshi. Now we will move on to our second case study. Roshmi, would you please share the screen? Roshmi? Yeah.
Hello, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have our second case study for Dr. Ketki Ranade. Dr. Ranade, are you audible?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
A 16-year-old boy is brought by his mother to a psychiatrist of her choice. The doctor tried conversion therapy on him to cure him of his homosexuality, and it left him devastated. In another case, a trans man approaches the doctor for sex reassignment surgery. The doctor criticizes him and tells him that what he feels is not normal and he should see a psychiatrist instead. So my question to you is, how is medicine influenced by social politics, law, and prevalent notions?
Right.
Dr. Ranade.
Yes, thanks, Moha. So I think partly when I started out by saying that science is not neutral, and I also mentioned what happened in the Indian context around changing of laws and how that changed in many ways, how mental health professional associations started to talk about depathologizing of homosexuality. So I think partly I have responded to the question of how medicine is influenced by law and social politics and prevalent notions. I'm going to actually take a minute or two. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So I'm just going to take a minute or two to respond to both these cases you have given, but I'm going to focus a little bit on the trans man because I think not enough has been said about trans issues. So what's happening in both these situations is that you have first case a parent and an expert, and in the second case you have an expert telling this person that who you are is a figment of your imagination, or there is something wrong with the way you are. Yeah. So the primary message that's going across to, in the first case, 16-year-old boy, second case, we don't know the age of this person, but this is basically a young person who's being told by possibly one important person in their life, that is a mother, and then an expert who could have actually had a chance to listen and try and understand what's going on with this person. But what you have is the experts sort of once again reinforcing a normative idea about gender and sexuality. And let's look at the second one. And I think, you know, what will happen to this person. So let's think about this. I don't know what kind of doctor this person has gone to for seeking some kind of gender affirmation. We've said sex reassignment surgery here. I don't know if it's a surgeon, it's an endocrinologist, who has this person gone to, but whoever is the expert that the person has gone to seeking some kind of gender affirmation. When the doctor is criticizing him and is saying that go to a psychiatrist. Now, there are 2-3 things happening here. One is that very often it may happen. One is the trans people get told that you know, just you don't know what you're talking about, you're out of your mind. Yeah? So it can either take the route of further pathologizing, which is to say that there is some kind of a delusional idea here, some kind of a, you know, a serious deep-rooted psychopathology. Other way in which this can go is learn to accept yourself. So another form of conversion treatment is the route that it might take. So ideas like, oh, you feel like this because you've grown up with too many strong female role models. You've grown up without enough strong female role models. So if you just have enough women in your life, then you learn to accept your femininity. And this idea that you have got that you're some kind of a man is something that will be erased. There are other kinds of stuff like the person may have been sexually abused as a child and therefore finds it very difficult, so denies their own femininity. These are common notions that we hear about around when you have trans people asserting their gender. This is obviously, since it's a trans man, the society is also very heavily invested in the idea of you know, somebody who's the world reads as a woman. So to make her a right and a good woman, the society is very heavily invested, and so is the doctor who's coming from the same society and who's coming from, as Dr. Tirthankar has just pointed out, from the same curriculum, same teachers. Yeah, you can't really say that medicine, science, all these things are acontextual, right? So what's likely to happen with this person? And if we look at, again, history of the way transness has been seen within the side disciplines. So one is sex and gender is all the time conflated. Sexuality and gender is all the time conflated. And so you have this idea of so a homosexual man is to be cured because he's too feminine. So, there is this constant conflation of sexuality and gender that happens. The other kinds of things you hear about is, I want to mention this guy called Ray Blanchard, who's a psychologist, who came up with this term called as autogenophilia. Yeah. And what he means in autogenophilia, he says it's sometime in the 1980s, where he says that these are basically heterosexual men who develop around puberty. They develop some kind of an arousal by cross-gender. So it's a cross-gender arousal. So these are heterosexual men apparently who are getting aroused looking at other men by imagining themselves to be women. Yeah? And so in fact, Blanchard says that this is some form of paraphilia, where the cross-gender arousal is a form of paraphilia which becomes the reason why these people then want to physically transition and live as women. How these are cis heterosexual men, I don't know. I mean, if you look at it, it's a description of possibly a description of a trans woman. The problem there is that trans woman or transness is reduced to sexual arousal. And there is somebody called a wonderful biologist. Her name is Serrano, Julia Serrano, who's a biologist and a trans woman herself. And she says that if you look at history of how transness has been viewed within the mental health sciences, there is always the sexualizing of the trans woman. So it's always in that context where what is being said is that why does she want to become a woman? She's imagining herself to be a woman. And having arousal at the idea of a man being attracted to her. So this is sort of essentially over-sexualizing of trans women. So I just wanted to say that what is likely to happen in the second case, that this guy may be termed as delusional and therefore may be treated which is really, really scary to think that this is somebody, because of their transness, they could be seen as someone who has severe mental illness. And the other thing that is likely to happen is that is some sort of a conversion, that only if you learn to accept yourself. So one of the things I remember, in fact, Aryan is here. One of the things I remember I learned from him very early on, and we were doing these training programs for mental health professionals, which was called Queer Affirmative Counseling Practice. It's a 6-day long certificate course. So I remember Aryan saying that we were talking about self-acceptance and in the context of conversion treatment. And I remember Aryan saying that in the case of trans people, self-acceptance is not the problem. The acceptance by the world is the problem. So this trans man is clear that he's a man. Yeah. The problem is the world is not able to see that he's a man. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Range of conversion treatments that we know happen, and where often medical establishments collude with family to sorry. Often where medical establishments collude with families to reinforce or enforce some kind of gender roles. We've heard about corrective rapes that happen. We've heard about forced marriages and such like sort of social medical procedures that happen in a situation like this. The immediate sense for both these people is, of course, that what will happen to their sense of self when their family and experts have told them that the idea that they have about themselves is something that is warped. And around conversion treatments, we have seen some of this. There is, again, I don't know, Sucheta was here a while ago. Sucheta Kennedy has written a recent paper on what she calls curative violence, to refer to conversion treatments. And the impact that something like being faced with conversion treatment at the age of 16 for the first person, what does it do to your sense of self-acceptance? Especially if you're living in a world where, visibility, visible role models, which are positive visible role models, what does that do to your sense of self and your self-acceptance becomes a real big question. So finally say that medicine, science, mental health practice is not happening in a vacuum. let's be very clear, the kind of questions, and I gave you the example of the conversion treatment thing. Just look at what happened to us when we were told that you can be converted, you can be changed because you're abnormal. The first response we made for many, many years was that we didn't say that we are not abnormal. We said conversion treatment will not really be, we got into whether it's effective, whether it's not effective. You may, early on, there was this idea, I remember, early on in activism in India as well. Some of the initial conversations that were happening with science and with medicine and with doctors was about whether homosexuality is natural. And one of the allegations that we were responding to was that homosexuality is seen only in human beings and not in other species. And you had a whole bunch of biologists who appear, who came up with, telling us a range of different, species, animal species, birds, etc., where there is homosexuality. So it's, it's interesting what happens. What are the kinds of challenges of abnormality, which are actually about the abnormal and the non-normative get equated in medicine, right? And get equated in science, and how we end up, caught up with those questions. So I do think that it is only now that we are able to ask the questions that we are able to ask about the harm that conversion treatment causes, and not feel the need to necessarily defend that, that we are existing, we exist in nature, we exist in nature, and therefore we are normal, and so on. So I think that shift has happened, and which is enabled now because of many social political realities. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, am I visible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Dr. Ranade, we have a question for you from one of our audience.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes. Mama, what is the question?
Yeah. Wait.
Oh, okay, you're scrolling.
Okay. The person says that I identify myself as a bisexual. I have been attending couple of counseling sessions, which keeps on telling me for being bi that you should have to have sexual and emotional connection with both genders. How can we handle these normative perceptions, which are often inflicted by the counseling space, which often mounts to more befuddlement and fear?
So thanks for that question. I'm going to answer this in a little more generic way, and hopefully in doing so will also specifically respond to your question. These labels of bisexual, pansexual, queer, etc. Who are they for, and what purpose do they serve is the first question we have to ask. And this is something we always talk when we are doing training with counselors, therapists, and so on. And we always sort of suggest that these are not, what is the point of these classifications? Yeah? They are meant for describing yourself. They are meant either to describe your gender, they're meant to describe your sexuality, your relational experiences, your desire, your intimacy, all of that, your fantasy, etc. So I would say actually to begin from here that what does bisexuality and what does a label bisexual mean for you? And actually, when I said earlier about certification, I was saying my gender is something I will decide. My sexuality is something I will decide. So I will decide whether being attracted to, whether I need to have 50% attraction here, 50% attraction here, then I am the real authentic bisexual. Or if it's 20 and 80, then I become more het and less homo. So all of these things are a label is something, or identity. What is the purpose it serves in my life? Yeah. When I started my talk today and I said I'm a genderqueer person. Yeah. It has, what I'm saying by that, I am saying something very specific about my gender location. And this term that I'm using it only to mean that, and it is serving a purpose for my self-description. So I think in some ways we'll have to, I would like to, is the question still here? Mahua, or you read it from somewhere else?
No, it is still there.
It's there. Okay.
Yeah,
Just 1 minute. Yeah. Okay. So
the third last one.
Yes.
Be specific.
Yeah. So it is a session where somebody is telling you this, right? That this is how you should feel. So I think, I can imagine when I think counselors or anybody, but particularly when experts tell us how we should feel. It can be, I completely agree with you, fear, befuddlement, and I mean, it is just terribly distressing. It an affirmative, and I mean, I always say this, that there is a difference between the harmful guys who do conversion treatments and the affirmative guys who will probably sort of, start from here, that what does being bi mean to you? What does sexuality mean to you? Does this label work for you? What else works for you? And so on and so forth. Yeah, I think there is a huge difference between these positions. There is also what we call as, today nowadays, many people say this, that they're queer friendly. And I really don't know what that means. Sometimes it means some of these things that we go and we learn. So I have learned yesterday that there is this segment of population called LGBTQI, and now I have gone and read some dictionaries and figured out and said, oh, B means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I'm trying to be friendly, and all that it means is that I have basically been educated and socialized in a cis-het paradigm, and I have now recently discovered this identity. And I'm not making a comment on your counselor because I don't know nothing about this person. All I know is what you said here in one line. But I'm saying that this is in a broader sense. Very often these things may happen because now many people are trying to say that we are queer friendly. Often all that it means is that we have just learned that there are queer people. It can mean that we have learned to tolerate queer people, or it can also mean that we have learned that a sizable group of people from whom we are going to make money, who will come into our clinic, are queer people. Yeah, and this is not the same as queer affirmation. So, I mean, I think I just wanted to make a generic comment to everyone. But Victor, I hope I have sort of communicated to you about labels and these things. What they mean for you is more important than any scientific classification and so on. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ranade. I would now ask Roshmi to move on to the third case study.
Yeah, just a second. Is it visible?
Yeah. Thank you. The third case study is for Dr. Tirthankar Guha Thakurta. Sir, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. So am I visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm reading out the question to you, sir.
Sure.
A 26-year-old woman who is lesbian presents to the Obgyn department with amenorrhea for 2 months. The doctor asked her if she is sexually active, to which she said yes. After this, she was prescribed a pregnancy test. In another case, a 24-year-old woman comes for a checkup to a gynecologist. On saying that she is sexually active and that her partner is a female, the doctor presumes her to be involved in oral sex when in reality she is not. In yet another case, a 32-year-old trans man had unprotected sex and realized the safest thing to do was to reach out immediately to a doctor for a post-exposure prophylaxis. The first doctor refused to treat him. Instead, he criticized him regarding his gender identity and sexuality. Then the second doctor he approached was uninformed about how the post-exposure prophylaxis and testosterone interacted. So my question to you, sir, is that how do we sensitize the medical fraternity about how a person cannot be presumed to be straight when they approach to a doctor, or how not to be presumptuous about the sex practices of the same-sex couples? Moreover, how do we make sure that doctors are aware of the drug interactions of hormone replacement therapy? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mohua, for the question. Now, see, this question has many constructs and layers. So let me break it up a little bit. This question talks about presumption. It talks about a generalization and stereotyping. It talks about the lack of knowledge in certain domains. And then it also talks about those individuals who are certified trained doctors. And that is where the problem begins. That means the certification did not come with a training that presumption cannot be done. That means the certification did not make it mandatory to learn about people who are not heterosexual, not cisgender. And now, you know that there is a saying in clinical medicine that we often say is that what your mind does not know, your eyes cannot see. That is very much true for clinical medicine. That is very true for this particular case scenario as well. If you do not have an exposure to the non-binary constructs of gender and sexuality, if you have no idea of how diverse the sexual behavior can be in each sexual orientation group as well, and that the biological sex, the gender identity, the sexual orientation, sexual behavior, and the social identity or the expressed gender of the individual can all be different and same as each other. When this fluidity is not taught, not observed, not experienced, you have a very little database on which you are extrapolating your conceptions. So if I have we have no idea of gender non-conformative individual, if we have no idea of how two girls might be engaged sexually, how diversely they might do that depending on their own individual choice. So your idea tends to be very much construed and constricted by the very little you know, the very little exposure that you have from the popular media, and it is of nothing to be surprised of that even medical professionals have very little idea of how to validate a truth. Research methodologies of questioning and logical fallacies are not taught to many streams of science. And this causes a problem. We do not know how to separate a fact from a fiction, and from whatever we consider to be true, we create our own knowledge domain based on which we extrapolate. So say for it, this is also known as a contact hypothesis. The people you are in contact with guide your perception of the rest of the world or the rest of the community. So if you have this idea that people who are lesbian have only oral sex, that idea can effectively change with exposure to knowledge. Or if you have friends who are lesbian, or if you have seen people who are lesbian and not having any problem. That is the most important part. The kind of work that Dr. Bakshi was talking about, the kind of work that we have seen in Evelyn Hooker's studies, where the non-pathologized population, the balanced, healthy population of the queer individual were taken as study subjects. And then the association with disease and the narrowed view of stereotypes gradually goes away. Regarding the interaction between drugs, you understand the loophole that we have in the medicine and pharmacology syllabus. It is very important. You might have seen in my classes also, when talking about estrogen, it's important to talk about estrogen, its clinical use in transitioning individuals, testosterone in transitioning individuals. While talking about the role of spironolactone, I typically use its historical role as an anti-androgen agent. Unless we know the history of the queer pharmacology, if I might call this, and make it a part of the curriculum that we teach, it is actually very difficult to normalize it, to demuseumize it. It should not be seen as a special case. It should not be written in the form of a footnote. It should not be written with red colors at the bottom of the page. It deserves the same font size, unitalicized, and to be in continuum of the same text that you are reading. That is how you normalize something in the study. I think if that is done, that will be good. This requires a review of textbooks and more academic activism, and only that can probably change this. Thank you. Moho, can you hear me?
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So we have a question from one of our participants that, hello?
Yes.
So the question is, are there other systems of healing that have a non-binary or non-medical view of the body?
Okay. I think a number of questions have come up. So maybe I can answer. Many of them are similar. So I'm also reading out from the chat box. There is one question is that I'm a medical student. I have a question. I have read about performing gender reassignment surgery on babies born with ambiguous genitalia, whereas the doctor assigns a sex to the newborn. It may so happen that the baby grows up and identifies as trans. So that is one question. Another question is how to take history in a clinical posting of a transgender individual. There is also another question that I found is, what does natural offense mean in that textbook and how that is present in the animal world? So, Mahua, I'm trying to answer all these questions together because we are running short of time, I think.
Yes, sir, sure.
You see, all these questions are pertaining to certain systems of belief or disbelief that are taught in the college. We have to understand that teaching techniques also rely on how that knowledge is generated. So what you teach is not figures, you teach interpretation of figures. And how you collect those figures, how you assort them, and what kind of interpretation you bring out of them depends also on your socio-political and cultural belief system. In that way, science cannot be separate from your political belief. Science cannot be separate from your social constructs. It almost always and invariably influences one another. I'll give you a very simple example. If a person believes in God, then the person is not delusional. If a person talks to God, then the person is delusional. But most of the people whom we consider to be the Mahapurushas, they always spoke to God. So you understand how religion, politics, how radicalism are related to the constructs of normalcy. Why religious faith cannot be considered to be a delusion or hallucination. Why a similar faith, which is not supported by religious pillars, will be immediately considered to be a delusional disorder or a hallucination, and he will prescribe antipsychotics for that. So the construct of what is right and wrong and what is disease and normal is not always set on biological empirical data. It is also dependent on social dynamics and constructs. Talking about whether homosexuality is seen in other species and whether it's biological, what I find important here to mention is that it is actually a very good study to see the sexual diversity in the animal kingdom, but using that naturally occurring diversity as a justification for what is happening in one species is actually a wrong use of biology. In a similar way, studying the genetics of sexuality can be very intriguing and very interesting from the academic point of view, but using the genetic basis of sexuality to normalize the sexuality is a wrong use of genetics. That is not what the purpose of the science was. I'll just give you a simple example. Maybe homosexuality has a genetic basis, or maybe it does not have. But if we think that it has a genetic basis and that is why it is normal, do we consider all other genetic phenomenon like cancers to be normal? Or do we validate heterosexuality after knowing which gene causes it? The answer is no to both of them. Because something exists in the animal world, it does not make it acceptable in the human society always. Sometimes they are called animalistic, and sometimes they are called natural. So whichever animal behavior you study, it is your social politics that is determining whether you will call it natural and justify this behavior to justify your own behavior, or you will call it animalistic and therefore reject that behavior in the human society. That politics of choice is always there. So it is not only based on data, it is also based on the generation of knowledge by interpretation of the data, by which the learning systems grow. That is a very important aspect of what we teach and where that knowledge comes from. How is that knowledge generated? So I think most of these questions that you are raising are results of the way we are generating knowledge and we are spreading the knowledge. If the method of looking at this data, the method of questioning ourselves and the existing databases that we have change, I'm quite sure the way we look at sexuality, the way we want to normalize and demuseumize sexuality will happen very fast. So it does not require a change in curriculum. It requires more a change in the outlook and the teaching methods, the research methodologies. Mahua.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Also, our viewers are very actively participating in our webinar, and this is very overwhelming. You know what? This is what gives us the motivation to conduct such a webinar. Now, I would like to transfer the mic to Roshmi. Roshmi, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
You can continue.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much everyone for joining the webinar and for the questions. This has been a really, really interesting session. I would like to thank our speakers for such an enriching experience this evening. You know, there's so many things that we see in our medical curriculum often that doesn't sit right in our mind, but we have no idea what to do about it. So it's been a really interesting insight to hear you guys speak. Uh, so yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Tirthankar Guha-Thakurta. Without you, we couldn't have managed to pull this off. And thank you, Dr. Bakshi and Dr. Ranade. Your insights on this topic have been such a pleasure to listen to. So um, I'll be ending this webinar by saying two things that we are doing in DFC right now. Just let me share the screen. 1 second. Yeah. So this is one of the projects that Doctors for a Cause is currently working on right now. We are very happy to announce our collaboration with the Rotaract Club of the Caduceus. Meducation 2020 is a medical fest in which we'll be having two webinars by Dr. Tirthankar Guha-Thakurta, who's our Chief Advisor of Academics and Education Task Force. And these webinars happen on 25th and 26th of September from 7 p.m. We'll be notifying the details on our socials, so please stay tuned for more updates and keep an eye on our socials. The second project that we are working on right now is Feed the Stray Challenge. So, in such harsh times such as the pandemic, the rate of feeding stray animals has declined by more than 50%, and millions of stray animals are suffering. So, the Animal Welfare Task Force of Doctors for a Cause presents the initiative of Feed the Stray Challenge. All you have to do is feed all the stray animals you can and upload a picture tagging us and nominating more of your friends. And you have to do this by tomorrow, and we'll definitely feature you on our socials. In September, we have also been celebrating Sexual and Reproductive Health Awareness Month and PCOS Awareness Month. So if you go on our socials, you can see all the posts that we've done on it. And okay, before I end the webinar, I would like to I would like to take a picture with everybody. So if you can please put your cameras on, it would be really nice. So we can just document this amazing evening that we have had. Guys, please put your camera on. Uh, Thankar sir, if you could please put your camera on.
You haven't warned people that their cameras will have to be switched on. People are figuring out the best way to switch on the camera. Hey, but nice to see some faces, some familiar faces. Okay.
I think so, can't share. Yeah. Also, we will be having another episode of Queer Conundrums very soon. We haven't decided on the date yet, but we will mention it on our socials soon. So please do join us for that. And this has been a very, very enriching evening for me, especially because, well, I, I have, I am the project head of LGBTQ Task Force of Doctors for a Cause, but I have very limited, knowledge about this whole thing. I just joined because this is something that I'm really passionate about and I wanted to help the cause. So yeah, this has been a very, very enriching evening for me. Thank you so much everybody for joining. It was very fun learning today. So this is me, Roshmi, signing off. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Roshmi, Mahua, Tirthankar, Kostav. Lovely evening. Lovely all of you who have stayed back for so long. Thank you. Bye-bye.
This was very new.
Thank you so much.
Speaking to doctors, this is very new to me and outside my humanities classes. So I believe we have been able to open a dialogue between two disciplines, humanities and medical sciences, and we would love to continue that further. I'm really happy that you are doing such wonderful work. Just come over across the road, like we are also doing the same on the campus of Jadavpur University, and we can have more real collaborations as far as activism on campus is concerned. So I would be very happy to see you in reality once the pandemic is over. Thank you
Yes,
so
Thank
much.
you so much.
definitely.
Thank you so much for this offer. We'll be looking forward to this.
Sure, sure. All of us, all of us. Yeah, you will be part of our classrooms now. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, bye bye. Thank you. Ketki, bye.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you, sir. Bye.
yeah.